The Silk Road isn't really a single road at all, you see. It's more like a web of pathways stretching across the largest continent on Earth, connecting civilizations that flourished in different corners of the world. Some of these routes crossed scorching deserts where temperatures could reach extremes beyond imagining. Others wound through mountain passes so high that travelers struggled to breathe in the thin air. Still others followed river valleys where green oases provided welcome respite. But the Silk Road was never just about geography or trade goods, though those were important. It was about human beings reaching across vast distances to share what they had created, to learn from one another, to discover that despite speaking different languages and practicing different customs, we are all fundamentally connected by common dreams and aspirations. Before we begin this journey through the depths of ancient history, I invite you to become part of our community of history lovers. If you find value in these carefully researched stories that blend scholarly accuracy with the comfort of a bedtime tale, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and press that like button. Your support allows us to continue bringing you these long-form historical explorations, and it helps others discover the true stories behind the myths. Ring the notification bell so you never miss our deep dives into the ancient world. Now let's begin. Tonight, as you rest, we'll follow the threads of this great network from its accidental beginning more than 2,000 years ago, through golden ages and devastating declines, all the way to its revival in our modern world. Each era has its own rhythm, its own story to tell. And each story is part of the larger human story, our endless quest to know what lies beyond the next horizon, to taste flavors from distant lands, to hear ideas that challenge and enrich our understanding. So settle in now, dear traveler. Let your breathing deepen and slow. Feel yourself becoming lighter, ready to float across time and space. The journey before us spans more than 2 millennia and stretches from the Pacific coast of China to the shores of the Mediterranean Sea. But time moves differently in this quiet space we share. Centuries will pass like dreams. Vast distances will shrink to the space between one breath and the next. Are you comfortable? Good. Then let us begin our journey along the Silk Road, starting in the year 138 before the Common Era, in the court of a Chinese emperor who was about to change the course of human history without even knowing it. In the year 138 before the Common Era, in the magnificent capital city of Chang'an, a place that would one day be known as Xi'an, a young man stood before the Emperor of China receiving an assignment that would alter the course of human civilization. His name was Zhang Qian, and he was neither a general nor a nobleman, but rather a low-ranking courtier selected for a dangerous diplomatic mission into unknown lands. Picture Chang'an in that distant time. It was already an ancient city, built on the ruins of earlier settlements, its walls rising high above the Wei River Valley. The city bustled with activity, merchants hawking their wares, scholars debating philosophy, farmers bringing produce to market. But beyond those walls, beyond the network of roads that connected the various provinces of the Han Empire, lay vast territories about which the Chinese knew almost nothing. Emperor Wu, who had ascended to the throne just 3 years earlier, faced a serious problem that troubled his sleep and occupied his councils. To the north and northwest of his empire roamed the Xiongnu, fierce nomadic warriors whose sudden raids terrorized Chinese settlements and disrupted the peace his ancestors had worked so hard to establish. The Xiongnu were masters of mounted warfare, appearing seemingly from nowhere to strike and then vanishing back into the endless grasslands before imperial forces could respond. The emperor's advisors had brought him reports of a people called the Yuezhi who had once lived near China's borders but had been driven westward by these same Xiongnu several decades earlier. The Yuezhi, they said, had been enemies of the Xiongnu and might welcome an alliance against their old foes. But to reach them, someone would have to cross directly through Xiongnu territory, a journey almost certainly ending in capture or death. Zhang Qian accepted this impossible mission. On a day marked by elaborate ceremony, the emperor personally presented him with a prized horse, its red mane gleaming in the sunlight. More importantly, Zhang received the Han envoy's token, a jade tablet adorned with colorful tassels that represented not just his personal authority but the sovereignty of the empire itself. This small object, which he could hold in his hand, carried the weight of an empire's hope. He departed with a company of nearly 100 men, including a faithful guide named Ganfu who was himself from the Xiongnu people. As they rode northwest from Chang'an, leaving behind the ordered world of the empire, the landscape gradually changed. Cultivated fields gave way to grasslands. Towns and villages became fewer and farther between. The settled world, with its comforting patterns and familiar rhythms, slowly dissolved into something wilder and more unpredictable. Within their first weeks of travel, disaster struck. The Xiongnu captured Zhang Qian and his entire party. But rather than execute them, the Xiongnu chieftain had other plans. Zhang Qian's obvious education and bearing suggested he might be useful. The Xiongnu kept him as a prisoner, yet the captivity was strange. They gave him a wife from among their people. He lived among them, learned their language, observed their customs. Years passed, 1 year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years. During this decade of captivity, Zhang Qian never forgot his mission. While he appeared to accept his fate, while he built a life and even started a family among the Xiongnu, his mind never stopped planning, calculating, waiting for the moment when vigilance might relax enough for escape to become possible. The Xiongnu, seeing his apparent compliance, eventually did grow less watchful. In the 11th year of his captivity, Zhang Qian and his loyal guide Ganfu seized their chance. Under cover of darkness, they fled westward, riding through the night and into the following days, putting as much distance as possible between themselves and their captors. They pressed on through landscapes that seemed to exist at the very edge of the known world. Vast deserts where the sun blazed mercilessly by day and cold settled like a heavy blanket at night, mountains whose peaks pierced the clouds, valleys where strange languages echoed. Finally, after months of hard travel, they reached the land of Deyuan, in what is now the Fergana Valley of Uzbekistan. Zhang Qian found himself in a world utterly different from the China he had left 13 years earlier. The people of Deyuan lived in settled cities, yet their culture reflected influences from the Greek kingdoms established by Alexander the Great's conquests more than a century before. They cultivated grapes and made wine. They possessed sophisticated irrigation systems. And they bred horses, magnificent horses unlike any Zhang Qian had ever seen. These Fergana horses would become legendary in Chinese history. Standing taller and more powerful than the sturdy ponies of China, they seemed to sweat blood when ridden hard in the sun. Actually just a trick of light on their reddish coats and the parasites that sometimes afflicted them, but the effect was dramatic. Zhang Qian recognized immediately that these animals would revolutionize Chinese cavalry warfare. He documented everything, filling his memory with details to report back to the emperor. From Deyuan, Zhang Qian continued westward and then south. Following ancient trade routes, he was among the first Chinese to travel. He reached the land of the Yuezhi, finding them settled in prosperous kingdoms north of what is now Afghanistan. But here he encountered a problem he hadn't anticipated. The Yuezhi, comfortable in their new homes and grown wealthy through trade, had no interest in making the dangerous journey back east to fight old enemies. They had built new lives, new cities, new relationships. The past was behind them. Zhang Qian could have turned around and gone straight home, his primary mission failed. But he understood that knowledge itself was valuable. He spent a full year among the Yuezhi, documenting their customs, their economy, their relationships with neighboring peoples. He learned of even more distant kingdoms, Parthia with its sophisticated culture and crucial position controlling trade routes between east and west, Bactria, inheritor of Greek civilization in the heart of Central Asia, and lands even farther west whose names were barely whispers of rumor. He heard stories of a great empire far to the west where people wrapped themselves in togas of fine cloth and where roads connected vast territories under a single rule. He learned of India with its ancient philosophies and its position at the crossroads of sea and land trade. He discovered that the world was far larger and more complex than anyone in China had imagined. When Zhang Qian finally turned toward home, he chose a southern route to avoid Xiongnu territory. But fate had cruel humor. The Xiongnu captured him again. This second captivity lasted 2 more years, until chaos following the death of the Xiongnu chieftain created an opportunity for a second escape. In the year 126 before the Common Era, 13 years after his departure, Zhang Qian returned to Chang'an. Of the 100 men who had left with him, only he and Ganfu survived to tell the tale. His hair had grayed. His face bore the lines of hard years and harder miles. But his mind overflowed with information that would reshape Chinese understanding of the world beyond their borders. Emperor Wu received Zhang Qian's report with fascination. The young courtier had failed in his original mission. He brought no alliance with the Yuezhi. But he returned with something far more valuable, a detailed account of lands, peoples, trade routes and opportunities that extended thousands of miles beyond China's borders. He described dozens of kingdoms, each with its own culture and resources. He spoke of goods that traveled along established trade networks connecting distant civilizations. He told of horses that could transform Chinese military capabilities and of crops unknown in China. Zhang Qian had discovered that China was not alone in the world, that beyond the grasslands and deserts lay other great civilizations, and that paths existed by which communication and commerce could flow between them. His accidental achievement would later earn him recognition as the man who opened the Silk Road, though that romantic name wouldn't be coined for another 2,000 years. The emperor, impressed enough to promote Zhang Qian to a position of real authority, began to see possibilities. If trade routes existed, they could be secured. If valuable goods and strong horses lay in the west, they could be obtained. If the Xiongnu controlled the paths of trade and communication, perhaps military campaigns could change that situation. In 119 before the Common Era, Zhang Qian embarked on a second journey westward, this time to visit the Wusun people in the Ili River Valley. Though this mission also failed to achieve its political goal of forging a military alliance, Zhang sent assistants to visit the Fergana Valley, Bactria, and Sogdiana. These men returned with even more detailed accounts of Western lands and cultures. The information Zhang Qian and his assistants gathered became the foundation for Chinese expansion into Central Asia. Emperor Wu launched military campaigns to pacify the Xiongnu and secure the trade routes. Chinese garrisons were established in the Heshi Corridor, the narrow passage between mountains and desert that would become the main artery of the Silk Road. The city of Dunhuang was founded at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert, destined to become one of the most important waypoints on the journey between east and west. But the Silk Road didn't spring into existence overnight through imperial decree or military conquest. It evolved gradually, organically, as merchants recognized opportunities for profit in the vast distances between China and the West. Local traders, each operating over relatively short distances, created chains of exchange that ultimately connected the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Before Zhang Qian's journeys, some east-west trade had already existed. Archaeological evidence shows that Chinese silk reached Egypt as early as 1070 before the Common Era. Nomadic peoples had long carried goods between settled civilizations. What changed after Zhang Qian was the scale, the security, and the awareness. Now the Chinese court actively supported and protected long-distance trade. The routes that developed weren't really roads in the modern sense. No paved highways crossed the deserts and mountains. Instead, the Silk Road was more like a network of paths connecting oases, trading posts, and cities. Caravans might follow one route through the mountains in summer when passes were clear and a different route through the desert in winter when water could be found in dried riverbeds. The northern route from Chang'an ran along the edge of the Darim Basin, a vast depression surrounded by some of the world's highest mountains. Oasis cities, Dunhuang, Kashgar, Khotan, dotted the desert's rim, each a vital way station where travelers could rest, resupply, and exchange goods. The southern route skirted the opposite edge of the same desert, linking a different chain of oases. These paths eventually converged in the valley of the Oxus River, in a region known as Transoxiana, literally beyond the Oxus. Here lay cities that would become synonymous with Silk Road trade: Samarkand, Bokhara, Merv. From Transoxiana, routes branched like rivers seeking the sea. Some went south through mountain passes into the Indian subcontinent. Others continued west through Parthian territory toward the Mediterranean. Still others curved north toward the grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. The goods that moved along these routes were as diverse as the peoples who traded them. Silk gave the road its name, but it carried so much more. From China came not just silk but also porcelain, lacquerware, bronze goods, and iron. From Central Asia came horses, jade, and precious stones. From India came spices, gems, and exotic woods. From the West came gold, silver, glass, and wool textiles. But the most valuable cargo traveling these routes couldn't be weighed or taxed. Ideas moved along the Silk Road. Artistic techniques spread from one culture to another. Religious teachings found new audiences. Scientific knowledge crossed linguistic and cultural boundaries. A merchant might carry pottery, but the potter who made it carried a lifetime of techniques learned from masters who themselves had learned from earlier generations stretching back through time. Zhang Qian died around 114 before the Common Era, never seeing the full flowering of the network his journeys helped establish. The Emperor Wu granted him honors and recognition, but Zhang couldn't have imagined that his name would be remembered 2 millennia later, or that the paths he explored would become perhaps the most important trade routes in human history. In his hometown of Qinggu County in Shanxi Province, later generations built a tomb for Zhang Qian. They erected sculptures celebrating his achievement. Much later, his tomb would be nominated for UNESCO World Heritage status as part of the Silk Road heritage. But all that lay in a future he could never have envisioned. What Zhang Qian did achieve was something more fundamental than opening trade routes. He demonstrated that the world was larger and more interconnected than anyone in China had believed. He proved that vast distances could be crossed, that different peoples could communicate and trade, that beyond the familiar horizons lay not chaos and barbarism but other civilizations with their own sophistication and achievements. As the first century before the Common Era drew to a close, regular contact between China and the western regions became established. What had begun as one man's desperate diplomatic mission, interrupted by a decade of captivity and redeemed by patient observation and meticulous reporting, had grown into systematic exchange between distant cultures. The stage was set for the next chapter in the Silk Road story, the classical period when Rome discovered Chinese silk and developed an insatiable appetite for it, when the Parthians grew wealthy as middlemen controlling the flow of goods between East and West, and when cities along the routes prospered as they had never prospered before. But for now, as you rest in your comfortable space, imagine Zhang Qian returning to Chang'an after those 13 hard years away. Picture him standing once more before the emperor, no longer a young courtier but a man aged by experience and enriched by knowledge. Hear him speaking about distant lands and different peoples, about opportunities for trade and exchange, about a world vastly larger than anyone had imagined. The Silk Road had begun, though no one called it that yet. It was simply the way west, the way to the western regions, the path that merchants and monks and soldiers and scholars would follow for the next 1500 years, carrying goods and ideas that would shape the course of human civilization. As this first chapter of our journey closes, let your mind rest with this image: a caravan of camels, laden with silk and spices, setting out from Chang'an in the early morning light, beginning a journey of thousands of miles that will take them across deserts and mountains, through cities and kingdoms, toward destinations they can barely imagine. The bells on the lead camel ring softly as the caravan leaves the city gates behind. The sound fades gradually into the distance, becoming quieter and quieter until it mingles with the rhythm of your own breathing, gentle and steady, peaceful and slow. As the first century before the Common Era gave way to the Common Era itself, the network of trade routes that Zhang Qian had helped reveal began to pulse with increasing activity. Caravans grew larger and more frequent. Cities along the routes expanded, their populations swelling with merchants, craftsmen, and opportunists seeking fortune in the flow of goods between East and West. But perhaps no development would prove more consequential than Rome's discovery of silk. In the year 53 before the Common Era, on a battlefield near the Euphrates River in what is now Iraq, Roman legionaries encountered something that would haunt their nightmares and fuel their desires. The Battle of Carrhae pitted the forces of Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest and most ambitious men, against the Parthian Empire. The Romans, confident in their military superiority, marched into disaster. As the Parthian cavalry wheeled and struck, their banners rippled in the desert wind, banners made of brilliant, shimmering cloth unlike anything the Romans had seen. The fabric seemed to glow in the sunlight, catching and reflecting light in ways that wool and linen never could. The sight was so startling, so unexpected, that some historians later claimed it contributed to the Roman panic. Whether true or not, the story suggests the profound impression silk made on Western eyes seeing it for the first time. Those banners were made of Chinese silk, transported across thousands of miles through countless hands before reaching the Parthian military. When the battle ended in crushing Roman defeat, Crassus himself was killed, along with most of his army. The survivors carried home tales of many wonders and terrors, among them those extraordinary banners that seemed woven from sunlight itself. Within decades, silk became the most coveted luxury in the Roman world. By the first century of the Common Era, demand for this exotic fabric had grown so intense that it alarmed Roman moralists and economists alike. Pliny the Elder, writing in the mid-1st century, complained that India, China, and Arabia together drained 100 million sesterces from the Roman Empire every year, an enormous sum representing a significant portion of imperial wealth. "Such is the cost to us of our luxury and our women," Pliny grumbled, displaying the gender attitudes of his time while also revealing the economic anxiety created by Rome's insatiable appetite for Eastern goods. He and others worried that Roman gold was flowing east in exchange for frivolous luxuries, weakening the empire economically. The fact that these complaints persisted for centuries suggests they had little effect on actual behavior. Roman demand for silk only increased. But Romans didn't understand silk. They had vague, often fantastical theories about its origin. Some thought it grew on trees like cotton. The poet Virgil wrote of forests in the east where leaves produced fine wool. Others believed silk came from a mysterious insect but couldn't imagine the actual process of sericulture. Pliny, who should have known better given his encyclopedic knowledge, wrote confusing accounts mixing truth with fiction. The Chinese, meanwhile, guarded the secrets of silk production zealously. They understood that their monopoly on this precious commodity gave them enormous economic and political leverage. For centuries, the death penalty awaited anyone who attempted to smuggle silkworms or reveal the techniques of silk making to foreigners. This made silk more than just a luxury good, it was a form of soft power, a tool of diplomacy and statecraft. Between the silk producers in China and the silk consumers in Rome stood the Parthian Empire, and this position made the Parthians extraordinarily wealthy. The Parthians controlled the middle sections of the main trade routes, particularly the crucial passages through Mesopotamia and Persia. When Chinese merchants arrived with silk, Parthian middlemen purchased it. When Roman merchants arrived with gold, those same Parthians sold silk to them at enormous markups. The Parthians actively worked to keep Chinese and Roman merchants from meeting directly. They propagated misinformation about the dangers of traveling beyond their territories. They emphasized the difficulties and distances involved. They sometimes told Chinese merchants that Romans would pay only modest prices, while telling Romans that Chinese silk makers demanded far more than the Parthians actually paid them. This careful management of information and trade flow allowed the Parthians to maintain their profitable position for centuries. The routes through Parthian territory were well established and protected. A Greek geographer named Isidorus of Charax, writing around the year 1 of the Common Era, documented a detailed account of stations along the road from Antioch in Syria through Mesopotamia and into Central Asia. He described the distances between stops, the facilities available at each station, the local rulers and their territories. His account reveals a sophisticated infrastructure supporting long-distance trade. From Antioch, routes crossed the Syrian desert via the magnificent city of Palmyra, which would grow fabulously wealthy from the caravan trade. Merchants continued to Ctesiphon, the Parthian capital, and Seleucia on the Tigris River. From there, the road led east across the Zagros Mountains to Ecbatana and Merv, where branches diverged, one heading north toward Bokhara and the grasslands beyond, another continuing east into Bactria and toward the Darim Basin. While these overland routes carried the majority of goods, sea routes were also developing. The discovery of the monsoon winds patterns, blowing from the southwest in summer and from the northeast in winter, allowed ships to make predictable journeys across the Indian Ocean. A Greek merchant's handbook from around 50 of the Common Era, called the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, describes ports throughout the Indian Ocean basin and the goods available at each one. This maritime traffic created another route for silk to reach Rome. Chinese merchants might transport silk to ports in Southeast Asia or India, where it would be loaded onto ships crossing the Indian Ocean to ports in Arabia or Egypt, from which it could continue overland to the Mediterranean. This southern sea route offered an alternative to the Parthian-controlled overland passages, though the distances were equally vast and the dangers different. Storms, pirates, and unknown navigation hazards rather than desert thirst and mountain cold. Along these routes, whether by land or sea, the physical cities and towns where merchants stopped became cultural crossroads where East met West in daily life. Consider Merv in what is now Turkmenistan. Originally an oasis settlement, Merv grew into one of the largest cities in the world by the 3rd century of the Common Era. Its population might have exceeded 500,000, extraordinary for the ancient world. In Merv's bazaars, a merchant from Rome might encounter a trader from China, though they likely couldn't speak directly to each other. Sogdian merchants, whose homeland lay between Persia and the Darim Basin, often served as interpreters and go-betweens, speaking multiple languages and understanding the customs of various peoples. These Sogdians would become crucial to Silk Road trade, their commercial colonies established in cities from the Mediterranean to China. Or consider the cities of the Darim Basin, Kashgar, Khotan, Kutcha, Turfan. These oases sat at the convergence of multiple cultures. They were technically under Chinese influence after Han Dynasty expansion, yet they maintained distinct local cultures while absorbing influences from India, Persia, and the nomadic peoples of the steppes. In Khotan, artisans learned to produce silk using smuggled silkworms, becoming the first place outside China to master sericulture, though their product never quite matched Chinese quality. The material culture of these cities reflected their position at the crossroads of civilizations. Archaeological excavations have revealed Greek-style sculptures alongside Buddhist imagery, Persian motifs mixed with Chinese characters, Indian artistic conventions adopted and adapted for local tastes. A piece of pottery might combine design elements from 4 different cultural traditions. A single tomb might contain Chinese silk, Persian glass, Indian gems, and Roman gold coins. The people who lived in these cities developed remarkable linguistic abilities. It wasn't uncommon for merchants and translators to speak 4 or 5 languages. Children grew up hearing multiple tongues in the marketplace. Religious teachers from different traditions might debate philosophy in whatever language they shared. This multilingual environment created conditions for rapid cultural exchange and synthesis. The goods flowing along these routes extended far beyond silk. From China came porcelain, though this early porcelain was quite different from the refined product of later centuries. Lacquerware, with its remarkable resistance to water and decay, fascinated Western buyers. Iron and bronze goods of Chinese manufacture found markets westward. Tea had not yet become a major export, its time would come centuries later, but dried fruits, ginger, cinnamon, and other products traveled the routes. From the Roman world came glassware of extraordinary quality. Roman glassmaking techniques were highly advanced, producing transparent glass when most of the world still worked with opaque glass paste. Chinese elites prized these glass vessels as exotic luxuries. Gold and silver coins flowed eastward to pay for silk and other goods. Woolen textiles of various qualities moved east. Coral from the Mediterranean found buyers in China, where its red color carried auspicious meanings. India contributed an astonishing variety of goods. Spices from South India and Southeast Asia, black pepper, cardamom, cinnamon, commanded high prices everywhere. Precious stones included sapphires, rubies, and the diamonds for which India was famous. Cotton textiles, dyed with vivid colors using techniques unknown elsewhere, competed with Chinese silk for luxury markets. Ivory from Indian elephants was carved into intricate works of art. But perhaps more valuable than any physical goods were the ideas and technologies that traveled the Silk Road. Different traditions of metalworking spread from culture to culture. Chinese bronze casting techniques influenced Persian metalworkers. Indian steel-making knowledge, which produced blades of legendary quality, moved both east and west. The Persian technique of making rust-resistant iron by adding phosphorus eventually reached China. Agricultural products and practices crossed continents. China acquired grapes from Central Asia and learned to make wine, though it would never replace traditional rice wines in Chinese culture. Alfalfa, crucial for feeding horses, came to China from the west. The walnut, the cucumber, the pomegranate, all entered China via the Silk Road. Westward traveled peaches, apricots, and citrus fruits from China's south. Mathematical and astronomical knowledge flowed along these routes. Indian numerical systems, including the concept of zero, traveled westward through Persia toward Europe and eastward into China. Chinese astronomical observations and calendar systems influenced Central Asian courts. Greek geometrical and astronomical knowledge, preserved and expanded by Persian scholars, spread across the network. Medical knowledge moved freely along the trade routes. Chinese physicians learned of Indian Ayurvedic medicine and incorporated some of its principles. Western medical knowledge, based on Greek humoral theory, reached Persia and Central Asia. Medicinal plants and substances from different regions became part of pharmaceutical traditions thousands of miles from their origins. A Chinese doctor might prescribe a substance originally discovered in India or Persia, while a Roman physician might use a remedy derived from Chinese medicine. The classical period of the Silk Road, roughly the first 3 centuries of the Common Era, represented perhaps the first great age of globalization. For the first time in human history, a relatively continuous network of trade and communication connected the Pacific Ocean to the Mediterranean Sea. Goods, people, and ideas could move from one end of Eurasia to the other, though the journey might take years and pass through dozens of intermediaries. This exchange operated on multiple levels simultaneously. At the highest level, emperors and kings exchanged diplomatic gifts and embassies. The Roman Emperor Marcus Aurelius reportedly sent envoys to China in 166 of the Common Era, though Chinese records suggest these might have been merchants claiming imperial sponsorship. Chinese emperors sent gifts to Central Asian rulers to maintain alliances and secure the trade routes. At the merchant level, large caravans organized by wealthy traders moved valuable goods across long distances. These merchants often specialized in particular routes or particular types of goods. A Syrian merchant might never travel farther east than Merv but would have agents and partners who continued the journey. A Sogdian merchant might maintain trading posts in multiple cities, allowing him to coordinate shipments across vast distances. At the local level, countless small traders moved goods short distances from one town to the next. A farmer might carry a small amount of goods to the nearest market town. A local merchant might transport those goods to a larger regional center. From there, another merchant might move them to a major trade city. Each transfer added to the cost, but it also distributed risk and allowed people with limited capital to participate in long-distance trade. The financing of long-distance trade required sophisticated arrangements. Merchants might form partnerships to share costs and risks. They might borrow money at one city and repay it at another, using letters of credit that worked across vast distances. Insurance arrangements protected against loss from robbery or natural disaster. These commercial practices would later influence the development of banking and international finance. The physical challenges of Silk Road trade were formidable. Consider a merchant organizing a caravan from China to Central Asia. First, he needed to purchase goods and assemble a caravan. Camels for desert crossings or horses and donkeys for mountain routes, sufficient food and water for humans and animals, tents and equipment for camping, weapons for defense against robbers. The initial investment was substantial. Then came the journey itself. Crossing the Taklamakan Desert could take months. The name Taklamakan is sometimes translated as, "go in and you won't come out," reflecting the desert's deadly reputation. Travelers relied on a chain of oases, each a few days' journey from the next. Miss an oasis, run out of water, lose the path in a sandstorm, and death became likely. The desert bones of failed caravans littered the routes. Mountain crossings presented different hazards. The passes through the Pamir and Tian Shan mountains reached altitudes where the thin air left travelers gasping. Snow might close passes without warning. Avalanches killed entire caravans. Extreme cold could freeze exposed flesh in minutes. Yet these mountains couldn't be avoided. They stood between the Darim Basin and the lands beyond. Then there were human dangers. Bandits haunted routes where caravans were known to travel. Some were opportunistic robbers. Others were organized gangs controlling particular territories, essentially demanding protection money from passing merchants. Nomadic peoples sometimes raided caravans, though they might also protect them in exchange for gifts or payment. Political instability meant that a route safe one year might be dangerous the next. Despite these challenges, the trade continued and grew. The profits available to successful merchants justified the risks. A merchant who successfully transported silk from China to Rome might multiply his initial investment many times over. Even with significant losses along the way, the trade remained profitable enough to attract new participants constantly. The wealth generated by this trade transformed the cities along the routes. Public buildings became more elaborate. Private homes grew larger and more luxurious. Religious institutions received donations from wealthy merchants seeking divine protection or expressing gratitude for safe journeys. Craft workshops expanded to serve growing populations and increasing demand for goods. This prosperity, however, was neither evenly distributed nor stable. Cities rose and fell with the shifting routes of trade. A city that controlled a crucial mountain pass might thrive for generations, then decline rapidly if trade shifted to a different route. Political upheavals in distant empires could destroy local prosperity overnight. The same interconnection that brought wealth also transmitted vulnerability. As the 3rd century of the Common Era progressed, the classical period of the Silk Road began to face challenges that would ultimately transform it. In China, the Han Dynasty, which had done so much to establish and protect the trade routes, fell into decline. Internal rebellions, factionalism at court, and pressure from nomadic peoples weakened imperial control. In 184, the Yellow Turban Rebellion marked the beginning of the end for the Han. By 220, the dynasty had completely collapsed, replaced by warring kingdoms. In the west, the Roman Empire faced its own crisis. The Severan dynasty ended in chaos in 235, ushering in a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century. For 50 years, the empire endured civil wars, barbarian invasions, and economic collapse. The silver content of Roman coins dropped dramatically as emperors debased the currency to pay for wars. Plagues swept through the empire repeatedly, killing millions. The Parthian Empire, which had controlled the middle sections of the trade routes, fell to the Sassanid Persians in 224. The Sassanids proved even more effective at controlling and taxing trade than their Parthian predecessors, but the period of transition created uncertainty and danger for merchants. These simultaneous crises in the 3 major empires connected by the Silk Road inevitably reduced trade volume. Merchants who had grown wealthy in the 2nd century found the 3rd century far less prosperous. Some cities along the routes began to decline. The classical golden age of the Silk Road was ending. Yet the routes didn't disappear. Trade continued, though at reduced levels. The infrastructure of caravanserais and trading posts remained. The knowledge of routes and markets persisted. Most importantly, the cultural and economic connections established during the classical period endured. These connections would prove crucial for the next great phase of Silk Road history, the spread of Buddhism from India across Central Asia to China and beyond. As this chapter of our journey comes to rest, picture the Silk Road at its classical height. Imagine standing in Kashgar on a busy market day. Around you swirl merchants speaking half a dozen languages. A Chinese trader examines Persian textiles. A Sogdian merchant haggles over the price of glass beads. In the distance, a caravan of camels arrives, dusty from weeks crossing the desert, their loads promising treasures from distant lands. The air smells of spices and animal sweat, of cooking fires and exotic perfumes. This is the Silk Road alive with commerce and connection, a vivid testament to humanity's drive to reach across distances and differences to share what we have and discover what others can offer. Rest now in this bustling scene, and as you do, let the noise of the marketplace gradually fade, becoming softer and more distant until it blends with the gentle rhythm of your breathing, peaceful and steady, carrying you toward the next chapter of our journey. In the quiet hours before dawn in the Bamiyan Valley of what is now Afghanistan, in perhaps the 3rd or 4th century of the Common Era, sculptors climbed scaffolding to continue work on 2 enormous statues carved directly into a cliff face. The larger statue stood 55 meters tall, about as high as a 15-story building. The smaller was 38 meters. Both depicted the Buddha, serene and monumental, gazing out over the valley that was then one of the most important stops on the Silk Road. These colossal Buddhas would watch over Bamiyan for more than 1,500 years, seeing countless caravans pass below, witnessing the rise and fall of kingdoms and empires, standing as silent testament to one of the most significant transformations in religious history, Buddhism's journey from its birthplace in India along the Silk Road into Central Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and beyond. The statues survived until 2001 when they were tragically destroyed, but during their long vigil they represented something profound. Faith itself could travel the trade routes, transforming as it moved while transforming the cultures that received it. Buddhism emerged in northern India in the 6th or 5th century before the Common Era, founded by Siddhartha Gautama, who would become known as the Buddha, the Awakened One. For its first several centuries, Buddhism remained largely contained within the Indian subcontinent. But beginning around the 1st century of the Common Era, it began a remarkable expansion that would make it one of the world's great religions. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road wasn't accidental. It was facilitated by specific historical circumstances, particular political configurations, and the dedication of countless individuals who saw value in sharing these teachings across linguistic and cultural boundaries. The story begins with the Kushan Empire, one of the most fascinating yet least known of the great ancient states. The Kushans descended from one of the 5 branches of the Yuezhi people, the same Yuezhi that Zhang Qian had sought centuries earlier for a military alliance. After being driven from their original homeland by the Xiongnu, the Yuezhi had migrated westward and eventually established kingdoms in Bactria, the region north of the Hindu Kush Mountains. Around the year 30 of the Common Era, one branch of the Yuezhi, the Kushans, began consolidating power. Under their greatest emperor, Kanishk, who ruled approximately from 127 to 150 of the Common Era. Though dates are debated, the Kushan Empire reached its zenith. At its height, it controlled territory from northern India through Afghanistan and into Central Asia, occupying the crucial central position on the Silk Road network. Kanishk's empire sat at the crossroads of Indian, Persian, Greek, and Chinese civilizations, absorbing and synthesizing influences from all of them. Kanishk himself became a patron of Buddhism. Buddhist texts describe him convening a great council to systematize Buddhist teachings. Whether this is historical or legendary, Kanishk certainly supported Buddhism and helped spread it throughout his empire. Under Kushan rule, Buddhism began its transformation from a regional Indian religion into an international faith. The Kushans minted coins that perfectly illustrated their cultural synthesis. Some coins showed Greek gods and used Greek letters. Others depicted Persian deities or Indian Hindu gods. Still others showed the Buddha with inscriptions in multiple languages and scripts. This syncretism, the blending of different beliefs and practices, characterized Kushan culture and created an environment where Buddhism could adapt to new contexts while maintaining its core teachings. In the Kushan territories, particularly in Gandhara, the region around modern Peshawar in Pakistan, artists developed a distinctive style that blended Greek sculptural traditions with Buddhist subject matter. Before this period, Buddhist art typically avoided depicting the Buddha himself, instead using symbols like footprints, empty thrones, or sacred trees to indicate his presence. But Gandhara artists, influenced by Greco-Roman sculptural traditions, began creating naturalistic statues of the Buddha. These Gandhara sculptures showed the Buddha with features derived from Greek artistic conventions: wavy hair, realistic drapery folds, idealized proportions. Yet the content was purely Buddhist. The Buddha in meditation, the Buddha teaching, scenes from his life and previous lives. This fusion of Western artistic technique with Eastern religious content created a powerful new visual language for Buddhism. Gandhara art spread along the Silk Road with Buddhist teachings. Merchants and missionaries carried small sculptures and paintings as they traveled. Local artists in Central Asian cities studied these works and adapted the styles to their own traditions. The image of the Buddha that eventually became standard across East Asia, the seated figure in meditation, the hand gestures carrying specific meanings, the serene expression, derives ultimately from these Gandhara prototypes. But Buddhism didn't spread along the Silk Road merely as an artistic tradition. It spread as a living faith practiced by real people who faced the genuine hardships and dangers of long-distance travel. Buddhist monks became some of the most important travelers on the Silk Road, journeying eastward to spread the Dharma and westward to seek authentic texts and teachings. One of the most famous of these traveling monks was Faxian, a Chinese Buddhist who left Chang'an in 399 of the Common Era on a pilgrimage to India to obtain authentic Buddhist scriptures. He was already about 60 years old when he began this journey, an age when most people would have been settling into retirement. Instead, Faxian embarked on a 15-year odyssey that would take him across some of the world's most challenging terrain. Faxian traveled with several companions westward along the northern edge of the Darim Basin. His account of the journey describes the difficulties vividly. Crossing the deserts, he wrote, meant following the bones of previous travelers who had died along the way. In the mountains, his party encountered snowstorms and extreme cold. Some of his companions died during the journey. Yet Faxian pressed on, driven by his devotion to obtaining authentic Buddhist texts. He reached Khotan, which by his time had become a major Buddhist center. The city's rulers patronized Buddhism and constructed numerous monasteries. Faxian reported that Khotan had thousands of monks and that Buddhism permeated daily life. From Khotan, he continued through other oasis cities, each with its own Buddhist communities, before crossing the mountains into India. In India, Faxian spent several years visiting holy sites associated with the Buddha's life, studying texts and collecting manuscripts. He observed Indian Buddhist practices and learned how Buddhism was practiced in its homeland. Then, remarkably, instead of returning overland, he decided to return to China by sea, an equally dangerous route involving months on ships crossing the Bay of Bengal and South China Sea. Faxian arrived back in China in 414, bringing with him numerous Buddhist texts that he spent the remaining years of his life translating into Chinese. His journey demonstrated the extraordinary dedication some Buddhists felt toward obtaining authentic scriptures and understanding the religion in its original context. His account also provides invaluable information about the state of Buddhism along the Silk Road in the early 5th century. Faxian was far from alone. 2 centuries later, another Chinese monk named Xuanzang would make an even more famous journey to India. Xuanzang left China in 629 without official permission. The Tang Emperor had forbidden travel westward due to unsettled conditions. Like Faxian, Xuanzang was driven by the desire to obtain authentic Buddhist scriptures and resolve doctrinal questions. Xuanzang's journey took him through the Darim Basin cities, across the Pamir Mountains, through Central Asia to Afghanistan and into India. He spent years studying at Nalanda University, the greatest Buddhist learning center of the time, where thousands of monks studied and debated Buddhist philosophy. He visited sites throughout India, collected hundreds of Buddhist texts, and engaged in philosophical debates with leading scholars. When Xuanzang returned to China in 645, he received a hero's welcome. The emperor, now recognizing the value of what Xuanzang had accomplished, provided him with resources to translate the Sanskrit texts he had brought back. Xuanzang spent the remaining 20 years of his life translating, producing Chinese versions of texts that would profoundly influence East Asian Buddhism. Xuanzang's journey also became the basis for one of China's most beloved works of literature, Journey to the West, written in the 16th century. This fictionalized account added magical elements, supernatural companions, and elaborate adventures while maintaining Xuanzang's pilgrimage as its core narrative. The novel shows how thoroughly Xuanzang's journey had captured the Chinese imagination. But while famous monks like Faxian and Xuanzang left written accounts, countless other Buddhists traveled the Silk Road without recording their journeys for posterity. Ordinary monks moved between monasteries, maintaining connections across vast distances. Merchants who were also Buddhist devotees carried texts and images with them. Artists traveled to study techniques in different centers. These anonymous travelers, whose names we'll never know, were equally important in spreading Buddhism along the trade routes. The caves of Dunhuang at the edge of the Taklamakan Desert provide extraordinary evidence of Buddhism's presence along the Silk Road. Beginning in the 4th century, Buddhists began carving cave temples into the cliff faces near this oasis city. Over the following 1,000 years, hundreds of caves were excavated, painted, and filled with sculptures. The Mogeo Caves, as they're known, became one of the most important Buddhist sites on the Silk Road. Pilgrims stopped there on their way to or from Central Asia and India. Wealthy donors financed new caves as acts of merit. Artists decorated the caves with elaborate murals depicting Buddhist teachings, stories from the Buddha's previous lives, scenes of heavenly realms and portraits of donors. These paintings reflect the multicultural nature of Silk Road Buddhism. The artistic styles show influences from India, Central Asia, China, and the Greco-Roman world. The depicted figures include people of various ethnicities wearing different styles of clothing, suggesting the diverse communities that pass through Dunhuang. Some caves contain inscriptions in multiple languages and scripts. In one of the Dunhuang caves, sealed sometime around the year 1000 and not opened again until 1900, preservationists stored tens of thousands of manuscripts to protect them. When this library cave was finally opened, it proved to be one of the most important archaeological discoveries related to the Silk Road. The manuscripts included Buddhist texts in Chinese, Tibetan, Sanskrit, and other languages, but also secular documents, contracts, letters, account books, that provide invaluable information about daily life in a Silk Road city. The Dunhuang manuscripts reveal Buddhism in practice, not just in theory. They include copies of sacred texts, but also meditation manuals, liturgical instructions, philosophical commentaries, and even Buddhist poems and songs. They show how Buddhism was taught, how monks organized their communities, how lay people participated in Buddhist practice. One manuscript is a printed copy of the Diamond Sutra, dated to 868, making it the oldest dated printed book in existence. As Buddhism spread along the Silk Road, it transformed and was transformed. The Buddhism that reached China was not identical to the Buddhism practiced in India. It had absorbed influences from the cultures it passed through. Greek philosophical concepts influenced some Buddhist interpretations. Persian and Central Asian artistic traditions shaped how Buddhist ideas were visualized. Local deities and religious practices merged with Buddhist frameworks. In China, Buddhism encountered sophisticated existing philosophical and religious traditions, Confucianism and Taoism particularly. Chinese Buddhists had to find ways to translate Indian concepts into Chinese terms and to make Buddhism comprehensible and acceptable within Chinese cultural contexts. This led to creative adaptations and new forms of Buddhist practice. For example, the Chinese emphasized the concept of filial piety, which seemed to conflict with Buddhist monasticism requiring monks to leave their families. Chinese Buddhists developed arguments explaining how becoming a monk actually fulfilled filial duty by earning spiritual merit that benefited ancestors. They created new sutras claiming ancient Indian origin that emphasized filial piety as a Buddhist virtue. Chinese Buddhism also developed distinctive schools not found in India. Chan Buddhism, known as Zen in Japan, emerged in China during the 6th and 7th centuries, emphasizing meditation and sudden enlightenment. Pure Land Buddhism, focusing on faith in Amitabha Buddha and the possibility of rebirth in his paradise, became enormously popular among lay people. These developments showed Buddhism's adaptability and its capacity to take root in new cultural soil. The spread of Buddhism along the Silk Road had profound effects beyond religion itself. Buddhist monasteries became centers of learning where not only religious texts but also secular knowledge was studied and transmitted. The technology of woodblock printing, developed in China, was first used to reproduce Buddhist texts before being applied to other purposes. Buddhist translators had to create new vocabularies and develop techniques for converting ideas between languages, work that advanced the study of languages and philosophy. Buddhist art influenced artistic traditions throughout Asia. The Gandhara Buddha images inspired similar works in Central Asia, China, Korea, and Japan, while each region adapted the forms to local aesthetics. Buddhist architecture introduced new building types, the stupa, the pagoda, that became iconic elements of Asian landscapes. Buddhist music and ritual influenced local performance traditions. Perhaps most significantly, Buddhism created networks of connection that transcended political boundaries. A Buddhist monk in Japan felt kinship with Buddhist communities in China, Central Asia, and India, even if he never traveled to those places. Buddhist pilgrims created routes of travel and communication that paralleled and sometimes diverged from trade routes. Buddhist texts circulated widely, creating shared bodies of knowledge across vast distances. The period from the 1st through 8th centuries of the Common Era saw Buddhism firmly establish itself along the entire length of the Silk Road. By the 8th century, Buddhist communities existed from India through Central Asia to China, Korea, and Japan. The religion had become one of the major cultural forces shaping Asian civilization. Yet Buddhism's spread wasn't without controversy or conflict. In some places and times, It faced opposition from adherents of other religions or from political authorities who saw it as a foreign influence. In China, several emperors launched persecutions of Buddhism, confiscating monastery wealth and forcing monks to return to lay life. These persecutions demonstrated that cultural exchange along the Silk Road could generate resistance as well as acceptance. Still, Buddhism proved remarkably resilient. Even after severe persecutions, it recovered and continued to flourish. Its ability to adapt to new cultural contexts while maintaining core teachings allowed it to survive political upheavals and social changes. The Silk Road Buddhism of the 8th century was diverse, vibrant, and deeply integrated into the lives of millions of people across Asia. As you rest now, imagine one of those Dunhuang cave temples in the early morning. Soft light filters through the entrance, gradually revealing the painted walls. The ceiling depicts a heavenly realm filled with celestial beings. The Buddha sits in meditation, his expression serene, his hand raised in blessing. A monk enters to perform morning devotions, his chanting echoing softly in the stone chamber. Outside, a caravan prepares to depart, the merchants and travelers offering prayers for a safe journey before setting out into the desert. This scene, repeated countless times across centuries in dozens of cities along the Silk Road, represents the deep integration of Buddhism into the daily life of these trading communities. The religion that had begun in northern India had found new homes thousands of miles away, carried along the trade routes by devoted monks and supported by merchants and rulers who saw value in these teachings about compassion, wisdom, and liberation from suffering. Let this peaceful image settle into your mind as this chapter draws to a close. The gentle sound of the monks chanting grows softer and more distant, blending with the morning sounds of the waking city, and then fading further still, becoming as quiet as your own breathing, steady and calm, carrying you forward on our journey through time. In the year 618, after decades of division and warfare that had followed the fall of the Han dynasty, China was unified once again under a new ruling house, the Tang dynasty. The Tang would preside over what many historians consider the golden age of Chinese civilization, and the Silk Road would reach perhaps its greatest flowering during this era of unprecedented prosperity, cosmopolitanism, and cultural exchange. The Tang capital, Chang'an, returned to its former glory after centuries of decline, became the largest city in the world. At its peak in the 8th century, Chang'an's population exceeded 1 million within the city walls, with perhaps another million in the surrounding metropolitan area. No European city would reach comparable size for another 1,000 years. Chang'an wasn't just large, it was magnificently planned, a grid of broad avenues dividing the city into wards, each enclosed by walls and gates that closed at night. But what truly distinguished Chang'an was its cosmopolitan character. This was a truly international city, perhaps the most diverse on earth at that time. Merchants from Persia, Arabia, India, and Central Asia maintained communities in the city's western wards. Nestorian Christians from the Middle East, Zoroastrians from Persia, Manichaeans from Central Asia, and Muslims from Arabia all built places of worship. The city had Buddhist temples, Taoist monasteries, Confucian academies, and foreign religious institutions all coexisting within its walls. Walking through Chang'an's markets in the 7th or 8th century, you would have heard dozens of languages. The air carried scents from across Eurasia: Indian spices, Persian perfumes, Chinese incense, Central Asian cooking. In the wine shops, you could taste vintages from the Darim Basin oases or the Fergana Valley. Musicians performed on instruments from half a dozen different traditions. Dancers from Tashkent or Samarkand entertained in entertainment quarters. Polo, introduced from Persia, became a favorite sport of the aristocracy. This cosmopolitanism reflected deliberate Tang dynasty policy. Unlike some earlier Chinese dynasties that viewed foreign cultures with suspicion, the early Tang emperors embraced international contact and cultural exchange. They saw engagement with the world beyond China's borders as a source of strength, enrichment, and prestige. The most powerful Tang emperors, particularly Taizong, who reigned from 626 to 649, and Xuanzong, who ruled from 712 to 756, actively encouraged foreign trade and welcomed foreign visitors. The Tang military secured the routes of trade and communication with unprecedented effectiveness. At its height in the mid-7th century, Tang power extended deep into Central Asia. Chinese armies defeated the Western Turks, establishing protectorates in the Darim Basin and beyond. Tang forces reached as far west as the eastern shores of the Aral Sea, bringing Chinese power to its furthest westward extent in history. This military expansion wasn't primarily motivated by territorial ambition but by the desire to secure the trade routes. The Tang established a system of protectorates and client states that created a security corridor stretching from China proper through the Tarim Basin into Central Asia. They built garrison towns, established military farms to supply troops, and created a postal relay system that could move messages hundreds of miles in days. The city of Turfan, in the eastern Tarim Basin, provides a remarkable window into Silk Road life during the Tang period. The region's extremely dry climate has preserved thousands of documents that would have decayed elsewhere. Contracts, letters, Buddhist texts, government records, even laundry lists and children's homework. These documents, many written on paper but some on wood, silk, or other materials, reveal the texture of daily life in extraordinary detail. One set of documents from Turfan records the activities of a Sogdian merchant family over several generations in the 7th century. We can track their business dealings, their family relationships, their religious practices. We see them trading in silk, grain, wine, and other goods. We observe them maintaining connections with relatives in Samarkand while building lives in Turfan. We witness the challenges they faced, debts, disputes, illnesses, deaths, and how they navigated these difficulties. These documents show that Sogdian merchants were crucial to Silk Road trade during the Tang period. The Sogdians, whose homeland lay in the region around Samarkand and Bokhara, were the great merchants of this era. They established trading colonies throughout the Silk Road network, from Syria to China. They spoke multiple languages, understood various commercial practices, and could navigate between different cultures with ease. Sogdian merchants often served as cultural intermediaries, not just commercial ones. They translated between languages, explained customs and practices, facilitated diplomatic exchanges. Many served as interpreters for official embassies. Some rose to positions of influence in foreign courts. Their widespread presence and their role as go-betweens made them essential to the functioning of the Silk Road network during the Tang period. The goods flowing along the Silk Road during the Tang era were more diverse than ever before. From China came silk, of course, but also porcelain of increasingly refined quality, tea which was beginning to be appreciated beyond China's borders, and paper which was revolutionizing record-keeping and communication wherever it spread. Chinese metalwork, particularly in bronze and iron, found markets throughout Central Asia. From Central Asia and Persia came horses, still highly valued for military purposes, along with jade, precious stones, and glass. Persian silverwork, with its distinctive designs, was prized by Chinese collectors. Central Asian carpets and textiles competed with Chinese silk for luxury markets. Musical instruments including the pipa and the eru entered China from Central Asia, permanently enriching Chinese musical traditions. From India and Southeast Asia came spices, gems, and aromatic woods. Indian cotton textiles, dyed with techniques that produced brilliant, lasting colors, remained popular. Ivory, both African elephant ivory that had been traded to India and Asian elephant ivory, was carved by skilled artisans. Precious stones, particularly those found only in specific regions of India, commanded high prices everywhere. But the Tang period also saw new categories of goods entering long-distance trade. Medicine and medicinal substances traveled along the routes. Chinese medical knowledge, particularly texts and practices related to pulse diagnosis and acupuncture, spread westward. Indian Ayurvedic medicine moved both east and west. Persian and Arabic medical knowledge, building on Greek foundations, found audiences throughout the network. Books and manuscripts became important trade goods. Buddhist texts still circulated widely, but so did works on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, history, and literature. The technology of papermaking, which the Chinese had invented centuries earlier, spread gradually westward during the Tang period. An Arab victory over Tang forces at the Battle of Talas in 751 allegedly led to Chinese papermakers being taken to Samarkand, though paper had probably reached Central Asia before this battle. Art and artistic techniques crossed borders with increasing frequency. Persian motifs appeared in Chinese decorative arts. Chinese artistic conventions influenced Central Asian painters. Indian sculptural traditions adapted to new subjects and materials in Central Asia. The result was a rich artistic synthesis where works often combined elements from multiple traditions. The Tang court collected exotic goods from across the known world with almost obsessive enthusiasm. Imperial workshops employed craftsmen from various countries. The emperor's stables housed horses from Central Asia. The imperial menagerie included animals from India and Southeast Asia. The palace gardens grew plants from distant lands. This fascination with the foreign and exotic pervaded Tang elite culture. Tang poetry frequently celebrated the Silk Road and the exotic goods and people associated with it. The great Tang poets, Li Bai Du Fu Wang Wei Bai Ji, wrote about foreign merchants, exotic products, wine from distant vineyards, music from Central Asia. Their poems capture the Tang fascination with the wider world while also sometimes expressing ambivalence about foreign influences. Li Bai, perhaps the most famous Tang poet, wrote extensively about wine, often specifically wine from the western regions. He celebrated the pleasures of drinking grape wine, a taste acquired from Central Asia rather than traditional Chinese rice wine. His poems conjured images of Central Asian dancing girls, foreign music, and the allure of distant places. Yet he also wrote of homesickness and of longing for familiar landscapes when traveling far from home. The cosmopolitan character of Tang culture extended to religion. Buddhism reached its peak influence in China during the Tang period, with magnificent monasteries built across the empire. But other religions also flourished. Nestorian Christianity established communities in several Chinese cities, leaving behind the famous Nestorian stele, erected in 781, which describes Christian teachings in Chinese using Buddhist and Taoist terminology. Zoroastrianism, the ancient Persian religion, maintained temples in Chang'an and other cities. Manichaeism, which had originated in 3rd century Persia blending elements from various religions, found followers particularly among Sogdian merchants. Islam began reaching China during the Tang period, with Arab and Persian Muslim traders establishing the first Muslim communities in Chinese port cities. This religious diversity sometimes created tension. In 845, Emperor Wuzong launched a severe persecution of Buddhism and other foreign religions, confiscating monastery property, forcing monks and nuns to return to lay life, destroying Buddhist art and architecture. The persecution reflected both economic motives. Buddhist monasteries had accumulated enormous wealth, and ideological concerns about foreign religious influences. Yet even this persecution, devastating as it was, couldn't reverse the cultural transformations that had occurred. Buddhism recovered, though it never again reached the heights of influence it had enjoyed earlier in the Tang period. The other foreign religions survived in reduced circumstances. The cosmopolitan character of Chinese civilization, once established, became a permanent feature even as its expression waxed and waned with changing political circumstances. The Tang dynasty's golden age began to tarnish in the mid-8th century. In 755, Enlil Shan, a general of Sogdian and Turkish heritage who commanded Tang forces in the northeast, launched a massive rebellion. Enlil Shan captured both Chang'an and Luoyang, the eastern capital, forcing the Emperor Xuanzong to flee. Though the rebellion was eventually suppressed and the dynasty restored, the empire never fully recovered its former strength. The Enlil Shan rebellion devastated large areas of northern China. Millions died from warfare, famine, and disease. The Tang government, to defeat the rebellion, recruited support from various regional military leaders, granting them significant autonomy. These regional commanders became increasingly independent, establishing what were effectively hereditary military governorships that acknowledged Tang sovereignty but exercised real power locally. Control over the western regions gradually slipped away. The Tibetan Empire, which had been expanding its power throughout the 8th century, occupied parts of the Darim Basin. Chinese military presence in Central Asia diminished. By the end of the 8th century, direct Tang control extended only to the Heshi Corridor, the narrow passage between mountains and desert that connected China proper to the western regions. Yet trade continued even as political control fragmented. The infrastructure of the Silk Road, the oases, the trading posts, the commercial networks, persisted regardless of which power claimed nominal sovereignty. Merchants adapted to changing political circumstances, paying taxes or tribute to whoever controlled the routes they traveled. The Silk Road had developed its own logic and momentum that transcended the rise and fall of particular empires. The late Tang period, from the mid-8th century until the dynasty's final collapse in 907, was marked by declining central authority but continued cultural vitality. Poetry and art continued to flourish. Commercial prosperity persisted in many regions. Buddhism, despite the mid-9th century persecution, remained deeply embedded in Chinese society. The cosmopolitan culture that had developed during the earlier Tang period left lasting influences. Even as the Tang dynasty crumbled, it left an enduring legacy. The ideal of a unified, prosperous, culturally sophisticated China connected to the wider world would inspire future dynasties. The cultural achievements of the Tang period, its poetry, its art, its embrace of foreign influences, would be celebrated for centuries to come. Many aspects of East Asian civilization that later became identified as quintessentially Chinese actually originated or developed during this period of intense cross-cultural exchange. The spread of Chinese cultural influence during the Tang period extended far beyond China's political borders. Korea, which maintained close relations with Tang China, adopted many aspects of Tang culture, law, and government. Japan, though more distant and independent, sent embassies to Chang'an and eagerly studied Tang institutions, art, and Buddhism. The written languages of Korea, Japan, and Vietnam all incorporated Chinese characters. Buddhist sects that developed in Tang China spread to these neighboring countries. This cultural influence flowed in both directions, of course. Tang China absorbed and adapted elements from the cultures it encountered. The Chinese zither, or guzheng, was influenced by Central Asian instruments. Chinese poetry adopted new forms and themes inspired by foreign music and literature. Chinese cuisine incorporated ingredients and cooking techniques from the wider world. Chinese art adapted foreign motifs and styles. The cosmopolitan Tang culture was itself a synthesis, blending Chinese traditions with influences from across Eurasia. As the 9th century progressed and Tang authority continued to erode, various regional powers emerged to fill the vacuum. The Uyghur Khaganate, which had helped the Tang suppress the Inlushan rebellion, controlled much of what is now Mongolia and the eastern portions of Central Asia. The Tibetan Empire dominated the Tibetan Plateau and extended its influence into the Darim Basin. Various city-states and small kingdoms controlled different segments of the Silk Road network. This fragmentation of political authority didn't halt trade but did make it more complex. Merchants had to navigate between multiple jurisdictions, each with its own taxes, regulations, and hazards. The lack of a single empire providing overall security increased the risks of long-distance trade. Caravans grew larger with more armed guards, to better defend against bandits. The costs of trade increased, though the profits available to successful merchants remained high enough to attract continued participation. The final decades of the Tang dynasty, from the late 9th century until the dynasty's end in 907, saw increasing chaos in China itself. Rebel movements, some led by disillusioned officials and others by peasant leaders reacting to crushing taxation and social collapse, carved out territories from imperial control. The emperor became a puppet manipulated by powerful generals. Provincial commanders fought among themselves while nominally pledging loyalty to the dynasty. When the last Tang emperor was finally forced to abdicate in 907, China fragmented into competing kingdoms, a period known as the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms that would last until the establishment of the Song dynasty in 960. This political fragmentation naturally affected the Silk Road. Chinese merchants still participated in long-distance trade, but without the security and official support that a strong central government could provide. Yet even during this period of political division, the economic and cultural networks established during the Tang Golden Age continued to function. Commercial relationships persisted across political boundaries. Artistic and religious exchange continued. The habit of cosmopolitan interaction, once established, proved resilient even in the face of political upheaval. As you rest now, imagine Chang'an at its height in the early 8th century on a warm evening. The city's great markets are closing for the night, but the entertainment quarters are just coming alive. Lanterns illuminate the streets. Music drifts from wine shops where merchants from a dozen countries gather to drink, talk, and make deals. In a Buddhist temple, monks chant evening prayers in a ceremony that blends Indian, Central Asian, and Chinese elements. In the palace, the emperor hosts a banquet featuring exotic foods from across Eurasia, entertainment by musicians from Samarkand, and poetry celebrating the vast, interconnected world of which China considers itself the center. This scene represents the Tang Golden Age at its finest, a civilization confident enough in its own achievements to welcome foreign influences, wealthy enough to acquire exotic goods from across the known world, and sophisticated enough to synthesize different cultural traditions into something new and magnificent. It was a moment of remarkable openness and creativity, made possible by the networks of trade and communication stretching along the Silk Road. Let this image of a vibrant, cosmopolitan world settle into your mind as this chapter comes to a close. The music from the wine shops grows softer, the lantern light dims, the sounds of the city fade like the last notes of a beautiful song, becoming quieter and quieter until they blend with the peaceful rhythm of your breathing, steady and calm, as we prepare to move forward to the next phase of the Silk Road's long history. In the year 751, on a summer day near the Talas River in what is now Kazakhstan, 2 great armies met in battle. On one side stood Tang Chinese forces supported by various Central Asian allies. On the other stood armies of the Abbasid Caliphate together with Turkish warriors. The Battle of Talas would prove to be a turning point in Central Asian history, marking the beginning of Islamic dominance in the region and the gradual decline of Chinese power west of the Darim Basin. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had overthrown the Umayyad dynasty in 750, represented a new force in the Silk Road world. The Abbasids moved their capital from Damascus to Baghdad, positioning themselves at the crossroads of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean, Persia, Central Asia, India, and eventually China. Under Abbasid rule, Islamic civilization would experience what historians call its Golden Age, a period of extraordinary achievement in science, mathematics, philosophy, literature, and art. Baghdad, founded in 762 by the Abbasid Caliph al-Mansur, quickly grew into one of the world's great cities. Its position on the Tigris River, with access to both overland and water routes, made it a natural commercial center. The city's circular design, with the Caliph's palace at the center surrounded by rings of administrative buildings, markets and residential areas, reflected sophisticated urban planning. At its peak in the 9th and 10th centuries, Baghdad's population may have exceeded 1 million, rivaling Chang'an as the world's largest city. Like Chang'an, Baghdad was intensely cosmopolitan. Merchants from across the Islamic world and beyond, Christians, Jews, Zoroastrians, conducted business in its markets. The city's markets offered goods from across Eurasia: Chinese silk and porcelain, Indian spices and gems, African ivory and gold, Scandinavian furs and amber, Byzantine textiles and metalwork. But Baghdad's most significant contribution wasn't commercial but intellectual. The Abbasid caliphs, particularly al-Mansur and his successors Harun al-Rashid and al-Mamun, became great patrons of learning. They established the House of Wisdom, a scholarly institution that became the greatest center of learning in the medieval world. Scholars at the House of Wisdom translated works from Greek, Persian, Sanskrit and other languages into Arabic, preserving and building upon the knowledge of earlier civilizations. This translation movement had profound effects. Greek philosophical and scientific works that had been lost or forgotten in Europe were preserved in Arabic translation. Indian mathematical and astronomical knowledge, including the decimal system and the concept of zero, entered the Islamic world and eventually passed to Europe. Persian literary and philosophical traditions merged with Arabic learning. Chinese technological knowledge gradually made its way westward. The scholars working in Baghdad and other Islamic intellectual centers didn't merely translate and preserve older knowledge. They advanced it significantly. In mathematics, scholars like al-Khwarizmi developed algebra and sophisticated trigonometry. The word algebra itself comes from the Arabic al-jabr, and algorithm derives from al-Khwarizmi's name. In astronomy, Islamic scientists created detailed star catalogs, developed new instruments for observation and refined calendrical calculations. In medicine, scholars like al-Razi and Ibn Sina produced comprehensive medical encyclopedias that synthesized Greek, Persian, Indian, and their own clinical observations. Ibn Sina's Canon of Medicine, completed in the early 11th century, became the standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for centuries. It represented the most advanced medical knowledge of its time, drawing on sources from across Eurasia. In geography and cartography, Islamic scholars created increasingly accurate maps based on accounts from travelers and merchants. Al-Idrisi, working in 12th century Sicily, produced one of the most detailed maps of the known world, incorporating information from Islamic, Byzantine, and other sources. His work demonstrated the vast scope of geographical knowledge accumulated through trade and travel along the Silk Road and maritime routes. This intellectual flourishing occurred within the context of a vast Islamic empire that stretched from Spain to Central Asia. The Silk Road's eastern portions now fell largely within Islamic territory or under Islamic cultural influence. This created new dynamics in trade and cultural exchange. Islamic merchants, benefiting from shared language, law, and religion across vast distances, could operate more easily than merchants who had to navigate between different cultural and legal systems. The Islamic world developed sophisticated commercial practices that facilitated long-distance trade. The concept of the saftaja, essentially a letter of credit, allowed merchants to transfer funds across great distances without physically transporting gold or silver. Partnership arrangements distributed risk while pooling capital. Islamic legal scholars developed commercial law that governed contracts, partnerships, and dispute resolution. Caravanserais, essentially inns for caravans, were built along trade routes throughout the Islamic world. These fortified structures offered security, shelter, and facilities for merchants and their animals. A typical caravanserai would have an outer wall with a large gate, a central courtyard where animals could be unloaded and kept, and rooms around the perimeter where merchants could sleep, store goods and conduct business. The most elaborate caravanserais included mosques, baths and markets. The Great Silk Road cities of Central Asia, Samarkand, Bokhara, Merv, Balkh, flourished under Islamic rule. Samarkand in particular became synonymous with Silk Road splendor. Under Islamic governance, it grew into one of the most beautiful cities in the world, famous for its distinctive blue-tiled architecture, its scholarly institutions, and its position as a commercial crossroads. A merchant arriving in Samarkand in the 10th or 11th century would have found a thriving cosmopolitan city. The markets offered goods from across Eurasia and beyond. Chinese silk and porcelain, Russian furs, Indian gems, Baltic amber, Mediterranean coral, all could be found in Samarkand's bazaars. Craftsmen produced their own goods, textiles, metalwork, ceramics, and the distinctive Samarkand paper, which rivaled Chinese paper in quality. Samarkand's paper industry deserves special attention. The city became famous for producing high-quality paper using techniques allegedly learned from Chinese papermakers captured at the Battle of Talas. Whether this story is accurate or legendary, Samarkand did develop a thriving paper industry that supplied much of the Islamic world. This paper facilitated the copying of books, the expansion of literacy, and the administrative sophistication of Islamic governments. Bokhara, not far from Samarkand, developed its own character as a center of Islamic learning. Its scholars contributed to theology, law, philosophy, and science. The city's libraries housed thousands of manuscripts. Its madrasas, Islamic schools, attracted students from across the Islamic world. The great physician and philosopher Ibn Sina was born near Bokhara and studied there before traveling more widely. These Central Asian cities maintained connections both with the Islamic heartlands to the west and with China to the east. Muslim merchants regularly traveled to China, establishing communities in coastal cities like Guangzhou and inland cities like Chang'an. Chinese goods flowed westward while Islamic products and knowledge moved eastward. This exchange continued even during periods of political tension, demonstrating that commercial relationships could persist despite official hostilities. The Islamic world's relationship with China was complex. Muslims admired Chinese craftsmanship, particularly porcelain and silk, while considering Chinese civilization less sophisticated than their own in intellectual and religious matters. Chinese, for their part, respected Islamic learning and valued Islamic goods while maintaining their traditional view of China as the center of civilization. These mutual attitudes of respect mixed with superiority were typical of relationships between major civilizations along the Silk Road. Trade goods flowing east to west during this period included Chinese silk, of course, but also increasingly sophisticated porcelain. Islamic markets developed strong demand for Chinese celadon, green-glazed porcelain, which was highly prized for both its beauty and supposed ability to detect poison. Chinese metalwork, lacquerware, and artistic goods found buyers throughout the Islamic world. Tea was beginning to be exported, though it wouldn't become a major trade good until later centuries. Westward from the Islamic world came glassware, which Islamic craftsmen had brought to high levels of sophistication. Cut glass, engraved glass, and glass painted with enamel colors were all produced. Metalwork, particularly in brass and bronze inlaid with silver and copper, became an Islamic specialty. Textiles including carpets, which would become perhaps the most characteristic Islamic art form, traveled eastward. Books and scientific instruments reflected the Islamic world's intellectual achievements. From India, which had strong connections to both the Islamic world and Southeast Asia, came spices that remained in constant demand everywhere. Black pepper, cinnamon, cardamom, cloves, these valuable commodities commanded high prices throughout Eurasia. Indian cottons, dyed with techniques that produced brilliant, lasting colors, competed with silk for luxury markets. Precious stones from Indian mines, particularly diamonds, were traded across vast distances. But the most valuable exchanges during this period were perhaps intellectual rather than commercial. The transmission of Indian mathematics, including the decimal system and concept of zero, to the Islamic world and eventually to Europe transformed mathematics and made advanced calculations possible. Indian astronomical knowledge enriched Islamic astronomy. Indian medicine contributed to the synthesis that Islamic physicians achieved. Islamic knowledge moved eastward as well. Chinese astronomers learned of Islamic astronomical instruments and observations. Islamic mathematical techniques influenced Chinese mathematics. Islamic medicine had some impact in China, though Chinese medicine maintained its own distinctive traditions. Architectural and artistic motifs crossed in both directions, creating that characteristic Silk Road synthesis where works combined elements from multiple traditions. The period from the 8th through 12th centuries saw the Silk Road operating with perhaps greater efficiency than ever before. The establishment of Islamic control over large portions of the routes reduced the number of political boundaries that merchants had to cross. Shared language, Arabic was widely understood throughout the Islamic world, facilitated communication. Islamic commercial law provided consistent framework for business dealings across vast distances. Yet this period also saw increasing importance of maritime routes as alternatives or supplements to the overland Silk Road. Ships could carry larger cargoes more cheaply than caravans. The Indian Ocean trade routes, connecting the Middle East with India and Southeast Asia, carried enormous volumes of goods. Some merchants specialized in sea trade, while others focused on overland routes, and still others combined both as circumstances dictated. The maritime routes connected with overland routes at various points. Goods arriving by ship at Persian Gulf ports like Basra or Hormuz might continue overland to Baghdad or Damascus. Alternatively, they might be transferred to other ships for transport to Red Sea ports, from which they continued overland to Cairo or Alexandria. This intermodal transportation required sophisticated coordination but enabled goods from Southeast Asia to reach Mediterranean markets relatively quickly and cheaply. The Fatimid Caliphate, which controlled Egypt from the 10th through 12th centuries, particularly benefited from this maritime trade. Cairo became a great commercial center, its markets offering goods from across the known world. The Fatimids maintained close commercial relationships with Italian merchant republics, particularly Venice and Genoa, which were emerging as major Mediterranean trading powers. These relationships created connections between the Silk Road network and European commercial systems. As the 11th and 12th centuries progressed, new political developments began to reshape the Silk Road landscape. The Seljuk Turks, originally nomadic warriors from the Central Asian steppes, converted to Islam and established a vast empire stretching from Central Asia through Persia to Anatolia. The Seljuks were generally supportive of trade and maintained the infrastructure necessary for commerce. Under Seljuk rule, caravanserais proliferated along major routes, and trade continued to flourish. The Crusades, beginning in the late 11th century, created both challenges and opportunities for Silk Road trade. The establishment of Crusader states in the Levant disrupted some traditional trade routes but also created new commercial relationships between Western Europeans and Middle Eastern merchants. Italian merchant cities, particularly Venice, Genoa, and Pisa, established trading posts in Crusader territories and developed extensive commercial relationships with Islamic merchants. These Italian merchants began to play increasingly important roles in long-distance trade, serving as intermediaries between the Islamic world and Europe. They transported Eastern goods, spices, silk, porcelain, to European markets, while bringing European products, woolens, metals, timber, eastward. Their activities helped integrate European commerce into the broader Silk Road network, though Europeans remained marginal participants compared to Islamic and Asian merchants. The wealth generated by trade during this period was enormous. Merchant families could accumulate fortunes rivaling those of princes. Successful merchants endowed mosques, madrasas, hospitals, and other public works as acts of piety and demonstrations of status. The patronage of wealthy merchants supported artists, craftsmen, and scholars. Trade wealth helped fund the architectural masterpieces, mosques, palaces, public buildings, that made Islamic cities famous for their beauty. Yet this prosperity was unevenly distributed and potentially fragile. The benefits of trade concentrated in cities and among merchant classes, while peasants and pastoral nomads saw little direct benefit. Political instability could rapidly disrupt trade, destroying fortunes and impoverishing cities that depended on commerce. The system worked brilliantly when conditions were favorable but remained vulnerable to disruption. As the 13th century dawned, the Islamic Golden Age was beginning to face challenges that would ultimately transform the Silk Road world. The Abbasid Caliphate, while still nominally ruling from Baghdad, had lost effective power to various regional dynasties. Political fragmentation increased. But the most dramatic changes would come from the east, where Mongol tribes were beginning to unite under a leader whose name would become synonymous with conquest, Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan. Before we turn to that transformative era, rest for a moment in 11th century Samarkand on a pleasant spring evening. The call to prayer echoes from the city's minarets. In the markets, merchants are closing their shops, calculating the day's profits and losses. In the madrasas, students debate fine points of theology and law. In workshops, craftsmen put away their tools, their day's work adding to the accumulation of beautiful objects that will travel across continents. Above the city, stars begin to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that travelers will use to navigate the desert routes, that astronomers will observe and catalog, that poets will invoke in verses celebrating the beauty and mystery of existence. This world of sophisticated commerce, advanced learning and cultural synthesis represents the Islamic Golden Age's contribution to Silk Road civilization. It was a world that valued knowledge, rewarded commercial enterprise, and facilitated the exchange of ideas and goods across vast distances. Though political challenges lay ahead, the intellectual and commercial achievements of this period would influence human civilization for centuries to come. Let the peaceful sounds of that Samarkand evening settle into your consciousness, the last calls of merchants, the discussions of scholars, the gentle sounds of a city preparing for night. These sounds grow softer and more distant, fading like the light fading from the sky, until they merge with the rhythm of your own breathing, calm and steady, carrying you toward the next chapter of our journey through the Silk Road's long history. In the year 1162, somewhere in the harsh grasslands of northeastern Mongolia, a child was born to a minor clan chief. His birth name was Temujin, and he came into a world of constant warfare between competing Mongol tribes. Nothing about his early circumstances suggested that he would grow up to create the largest contiguous land empire in human history, transforming the Silk Road and indeed the entire course of world civilization. Temujin's early life was brutal. His father was poisoned by enemies when Temujin was about 9 years old, leaving the family destitute and vulnerable. His own clan abandoned them. For years, Temujin, his mother, and his siblings lived on the edge of survival, hunting, fishing, and gathering to stay alive. He was briefly enslaved by a rival clan. These hardships forged a character of remarkable determination, strategic brilliance, and ruthlessness. By his 30s, through a combination of military skill, political acumen, and sheer force of personality, Temujin had begun to unite the fractious Mongol tribes under his leadership. In 1206, at a great assembly known as a Kurultai, he was proclaimed Genghis Khan, universal ruler. He was about 44 years old, an age when most warriors would be thinking about retirement. Instead, he was beginning a career of conquest that would terrorize civilizations from China to Eastern Europe. The Mongol armies that Genghis Khan led were unlike anything the settled civilizations of Eurasia had encountered. These were not massive infantry formations but swift cavalry forces capable of covering vast distances at remarkable speed. Mongol warriors were trained from childhood in horsemanship and archery. They could shoot accurately from horseback while riding at full gallop. They could survive for days on minimal rations. Each warrior typically had several horses, allowing them to cover more than 100 miles in a day by switching mounts. But the Mongols weren't merely fierce warriors, they were sophisticated military strategists. Genghis Khan organized his forces with decimal precision. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 with clear chains of command. He employed elaborate intelligence networks, sending spies ahead to gather information about enemy forces and terrain. He used psychological warfare, deliberately spreading tales of Mongol brutality to terrorize enemies into surrendering without fight. The Mongols also proved adept at siege warfare, despite coming from a pastoral nomadic society with no tradition of besieging cities. They recruited engineers from conquered peoples, particularly Chinese and Persian engineers skilled in siege warfare, and incorporated their knowledge into Mongol military operations. They employed catapults, battering rams, and other siege equipment. They diverted rivers to flood cities. They showed remarkable adaptability, learning and adopting whatever techniques proved effective. Genghis Khan's first major conquests targeted the Tangut Kingdom of Western Xia in northwestern China and the Jin dynasty in northern China. These campaigns lasted for years, involving numerous battles and sieges. The Mongols proved brutal when cities resisted, massacring populations to encourage others to surrender peacefully. They proved generous to those who surrendered without resistance, often incorporating conquered peoples into their empire with relatively little disruption to local customs and governance. In 1218, Genghis Khan sent a large trade caravan to the Khwarezmian Empire, which controlled much of Central Asia including the Great Silk Road cities of Samarkand, Bokhara, and Merv. The local governor of the border city of Otrar, suspecting the caravan members of being spies, arrested them and seized their goods. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding restitution, the Khwarezmian Shah had the lead ambassador killed and sent the others back with their beards shaved, a grave insult in Mongol culture. This proved to be one of the most consequential mistakes in history. An enraged Genghis Khan turned his full attention westward. The Mongol invasion of the Khwarezmian Empire, beginning in 1219, would devastate Central Asia and alter the course of Silk Road history. The great cities that had flourished for centuries as centers of Islamic civilization and trade would experience catastrophic destruction. The conquest was swift and merciless. Bokhara fell in 1220 after its garrison attempted to break out and was destroyed. The city was sacked, though not completely destroyed. Genghis Khan reportedly marveled at its magnificent buildings. Samarkand surrendered after a brief siege, but Genghis Khan ordered the execution of the garrison and the deportation of craftsmen to Mongolia, where their skills could serve the Mongol Empire. Merv, one of the greatest cities in the Islamic world, experienced perhaps the worst fate. When it fell in 1221, the Mongols allegedly massacred the entire population. Medieval sources claim numbers in the hundreds of thousands, though modern historians question whether the city's population was actually that large. Even accounting for medieval exaggeration, the destruction was catastrophic. The city that had been a jewel of Islamic civilization lay in ruins. The psychological impact of these conquests extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Stories of Mongol brutality spread terror throughout the Islamic world and beyond. Cities and regions that might have resisted instead surrendered, hoping to avoid the fate of those who had fought. The Mongols cultivated this terror deliberately, understanding that reputation could accomplish what armies alone could not. Yet the Mongol Empire wasn't simply an engine of destruction. Genghis Khan proved to be a sophisticated administrator as well as a brilliant general. He established a law code, the Yasa, that governed Mongol society and eventually extended to conquered territories. The Yasa emphasized loyalty, discipline, and meritocracy. Advancement in Mongol service depended on ability rather than birth, a revolutionary principle in societies where aristocratic birth typically determined status. Genghis Khan also proved remarkably tolerant in religious matters. Though the Mongols practiced shamanism and revered the sky god Tingri, Genghis Khan exempted religious institutions of all faiths from taxation and protected freedom of worship. This religious tolerance would characterize the Mongol Empire throughout its existence. Buddhist monks, Muslim scholars, Christian clergy, and shamans all found places within the Mongol system. When Genghis Khan died in 1227, the exact circumstances remain unclear, though he was campaigning against the Tangut kingdom at the time. He had created an empire stretching from northern China through Central Asia to the shores of the Caspian Sea. His sons and grandsons would expand it further still, creating an empire that at its height extended from Korea to Hungary, from Siberia to the Persian Gulf. The division of this vast empire among Genghis Khan's descendants created four main khanates: the Golden Horde controlling the western steppes in Russia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, the Ilkhanate in Persia and the Middle East, and the Yuan dynasty in China and Mongolia. Though these khanates eventually became independent and sometimes hostile to each other, during the 13th and early 14th centuries they maintained enough cooperation to create what historians call the Pax Mongolica, the Mongol Peace. The Pax Mongolica transformed the Silk Road. For the first time in history, a single political system controlled nearly the entire overland route from China to Europe. Mongol law protected merchants. Mongol postal stations provided regular stopping points with fresh horses and supplies. Mongol military patrols kept routes relatively safe from bandits. The Mongols established a sophisticated passport system allowing authorized travelers to move freely throughout the empire. Merchants responded enthusiastically to these favorable conditions. Trade volume along the Silk Road increased dramatically. The journey from Europe to China, while still arduous and dangerous, became more feasible than ever before. Traveling times decreased as infrastructure improved. Communication accelerated. Messages could travel from China to Persia in weeks rather than months. The Mongol rulers actively encouraged trade, recognizing it as a source of revenue and useful goods. They granted privileges to merchant associations. They maintained caravanserais and ensured water supplies along routes. They standardized weights and measures across their territories. They even established a form of paper currency in some regions, though this met with mixed success outside China. Kublai Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan who completed the conquest of China and established the Yuan dynasty, proved particularly supportive of merchants and trade. He built a new capital at Kambalik, modern Beijing, that became one of the most magnificent cities in the world. He constructed roads and canals to facilitate commerce. He welcomed foreign merchants, granting many of them positions of responsibility in his administration. It was during the Pax Mongolica that European travelers began visiting China in significant numbers for the first time. The most famous of these travelers was Marco Polo, a Venetian merchant who spent 17 years in Mongol service, primarily in China, between 1275 and 1292. His account of his travels, dictated after his return to Venice, became one of the most influential books of the medieval period. Marco Polo's descriptions of China and the Mongol Empire astonished Europeans. He described cities larger than any in Europe, wealth beyond European comprehension, customs and technologies unknown in the West. He wrote of paper money, coal for fuel, asbestos cloth, efficient postal systems and administrative sophistication. He described the splendor of Kublai Khan's court, the vastness of China, the efficiency of Mongol governance. Some of Marco Polo's contemporaries doubted his accounts, thinking them exaggerated or fabricated. On his deathbed, when urged to admit he had lied about his travels, Marco Polo reportedly replied that he had not told half of what he had seen. Modern scholarship confirms that while his book contains errors and probably some second-hand material, the basic framework of his travels was genuine and his descriptions, however amazing they seemed to Europeans, were largely accurate. Marco Polo wasn't the only European to travel the Silk Road during this period. Franciscan friars sent by the Pope to establish contact with Mongol rulers left accounts of their journeys. John of Plano Carpini traveled to Mongolia in the 1240s, attending the election of a new great Khan. William of Rubruck visited the Mongol court in the 1250s, leaving a detailed account of Mongol culture and customs. These travelers demonstrated that the journey from Europe to Central Asia and even to China, while difficult, was achievable. The Mongol period also saw travelers moving from east to west. Chinese officials and merchants traveled to Persia and beyond on diplomatic or commercial missions. Persian administrators served in China. Muslim scholars moved between different parts of the Mongol Empire. Artists, craftsmen, and intellectuals of various backgrounds found opportunities in the cosmopolitan environment of Mongol courts. This unprecedented movement of people and ideas created remarkable cultural syntheses. In Persia, Chinese painting techniques influenced Persian miniature painting. Chinese dragons appeared in Persian decorative arts. Conversely, Persian astronomical instruments and knowledge reached China, influencing Chinese astronomy. Persian administrative practices affected Chinese governance under Mongol rule. The movement of technology accelerated during this period. Gunpowder, invented in China centuries earlier, spread westward during the Mongol era. The Mongols themselves used gunpowder weapons, particularly in siege warfare, and the knowledge of gunpowder manufacture followed Mongol conquests. By the 14th century, gunpowder weapons were appearing in Europe, ultimately revolutionizing warfare worldwide. Printing technology also spread westward, though more slowly. The Mongols used Chinese printing for paper money in some documents. Knowledge of printing techniques reached Persia and the Middle East, though widespread adoption would take centuries. Other Chinese technologies, sophisticated looms for textile production, advanced metallurgical techniques, agricultural innovations, moved along the trade routes during this period. Medical knowledge crossed continents as well. Chinese physicians learned of Islamic medicine. Islamic doctors encountered Chinese medical practices. The exchange wasn't always positive. We'll discuss disease transmission shortly, but it expanded medical knowledge in various traditions. Pharmacological knowledge spread, with physicians learning of medicinal substances from distant regions. The cuisine of different regions influenced each other during this period of intense contact. Pasta, which may have already existed in Italy, possibly received influences from Chinese noodle making. Various fruits, vegetables, and cooking techniques spread along the routes. The cosmopolitan character of Mongol courts, where banquets featured foods from across the empire, accelerated culinary exchange. Yet the Pax Mongolica, for all its benefits to trade and cultural exchange, came at an enormous human cost. The Mongol conquest killed millions. Entire cities were depopulated. Agricultural lands were devastated. Irrigation systems that had sustained civilizations for centuries were destroyed. The demographic impact on Central Asia and Persia was catastrophic, with some regions taking centuries to recover their pre-Mongol population levels. The Mongol period also coincided with what may have been the most devastating pandemic in human history, the Black Death. The plague bacterium Yersinia pestis likely originated in or near China and spread westward along the trade routes during the 14th century. The Mongol Empire's extensive communication networks, while facilitating trade and cultural exchange, also provided pathways for disease transmission. The Black Death reached Europe in 1346 or 1347, arriving via the Crimean port of Kaffa on the Black Sea. According to one account, Mongol forces besieging the city catapulted plague-infected corpses over the walls, though historians debate whether this really happened or whether rats carrying infected fleas were sufficient. Regardless of how it arrived in Europe, the plague spread with devastating speed, killing perhaps one-third of Europe's population within a few years. The plague also ravaged the Middle East, Central Asia, and China, though documentation is less complete for these regions. Its impact on Silk Road trade was profound. Merchants fled from infected cities. Trade routes that had hummed with activity fell silent. Cities that had prospered from commerce saw their populations decimated. The psychological impact was equally significant. The plague seemed to demonstrate divine punishment or cosmic disorder, shaking faith and social structures. As the 14th century progressed, the Mongol Empire began to fragment. The various khanates increasingly pursued independent policies and sometimes fought each other. The Yuan dynasty in China faced growing Chinese resistance, culminating in rebellions that drove the Mongols from China in 1368. The Golden Horde in Russia gradually weakened. The Ilkhanate in Persia collapsed into competing regional powers. The fragmentation of Mongol power didn't immediately destroy the Silk Road. Trade networks had survived the collapse of empires before. But the combination of political fragmentation, plague devastation, and other factors would ultimately transform long-distance trade patterns. The classical overland Silk Road was entering a period of decline from which it would never fully recover. Yet before that decline became irreversible, the Mongol period gave the Silk Road one last brilliant flowering. The extent of cultural exchange, the volume of trade, and the movement of people and ideas during the 13th and early 14th centuries exceeded anything that had come before. The Mongol Empire, despite its brutality, created conditions that allowed unprecedented global connection. Consider a merchant in 1300, planning a journey from Venice to China. A century earlier, such a journey would have seemed nearly impossible, requiring passage through multiple hostile territories, facing countless dangers, with no assurance of safe passage or favorable commercial conditions. But in 1300, traveling under Mongol protection with Mongol passports, stopping at Mongol postal stations, the journey was difficult but feasible. Many merchants made it successfully. This merchant would have traveled from Venice through Constantinople, across the Black Sea to the Crimea, through the lands of the Golden Horde to Central Asia, and finally to China. Along the way he would have witnessed the incredible diversity of the Mongol Empire: Orthodox Christian Russians, Muslim Central Asians, Buddhist Mongolians, Confucian Chinese, all living under Mongol rule. He would have seen Mongol governance accommodating and utilizing all these different traditions. In Kambalik, he would have found an international city where merchants from across Eurasia conducted business. The government employed administrators from many backgrounds: Mongols in military positions, but Muslims, Christians, and Chinese in civil administration. The postal system brought news from across the empire within weeks. Markets offered goods from everywhere the Mongol writ extended and beyond. Yet this magnificent cosmopolitan system was already showing signs of strain. The different khanates pursued increasingly independent foreign policies. Trade disputes arose. Wars broke out between different branches of the Mongol royal family. The Yuan dynasty faced growing opposition from Chinese nationalist movements. The plague devastated populations throughout the empire. By the middle of the 14th century, the Pax Mongolica was crumbling. The brief window during which travel from Europe to China was relatively safe and straightforward was closing. The conditions that had allowed Marco Polo's travels would not persist much longer. A new era was beginning, one characterized by the decline of the overland Silk Road and the rise of maritime trade routes that would ultimately supersede it. But before we move to that transition, rest for a moment in the year 1300 in Samarkand, now under Mongol rule. The city has recovered somewhat from the devastation of Genghis Khan's conquest 80 years earlier. Markets once again bustle with activity. Caravans arrive daily from both east and west. In the city's caravanserais, merchants from Venice discuss silk prices with Mongol officials while Persian traders negotiate with Chinese counterparts. A Franciscan friar, traveling to the Mongol court on a papal mission, writes letters describing the wonders he's witnessed. A Chinese official, posted to Central Asia as part of Mongol administration, composes poetry expressing homesickness for his native Hangzhou. A Muslim scholar discusses astronomy with a Buddhist monk, comparing their different calendrical systems and star catalogs. This is the Silk Road at its most cosmopolitan, a moment of unprecedented global connection. Let this scene settle into your awareness: the many languages spoken in the markets, the diverse faces and clothing styles, the goods from across the known world displayed for sale, the mingling of different religious and cultural traditions. All of this is made possible by the Mongol system, brutal in its creation but effective in facilitating exchange. And as you contemplate this scene, let the sounds of that busy marketplace gradually soften, the conversations becoming murmurs, then whispers, then blending into the gentle rhythm of your breathing, calm and peaceful, as we prepare to move forward to the next chapter of our journey. The year 1405 marked a turning point in global maritime history, though few at the time could have recognized its significance. In that year, a massive Chinese fleet sailed from the port of Suzhou under the command of Admiral Zheng He, beginning the first of 7 extraordinary voyages that would take Chinese ships to Southeast Asia, India, Arabia, and the east coast of Africa. These voyages demonstrated China's technological capability to dominate maritime trade routes if it chose to do so. Yet within a few decades of Zheng He's final voyage in 1433, China would abandon long-distance maritime expeditions entirely. The Ming dynasty, which had driven the Mongols from China in 1368 and now ruled, turned increasingly inward. This Chinese withdrawal from maritime trade was one of several developments during the 15th and 16th centuries that would transform global trade patterns and ultimately marginalize the overland Silk Road. The Ming dynasty's early years saw continued engagement with the Silk Road. The first Ming emperor, Hongwu, maintained diplomatic and trade relations with Central Asian powers. His successors continued these relationships, and the overland trade routes remained active, if diminished from their Mongol-era peak. Chinese goods still flowed westward, and Central Asian and Middle Eastern products entered China via the traditional routes. But the Ming gradually implemented policies that reduced China's engagement with the wider world. Restrictions on private maritime trade, prohibitions against Chinese traveling abroad without authorization, and emphasis on traditional Confucian values over cosmopolitan engagement all contributed to China's retreat from the international stage. This inward turn contrasted sharply with the outward expansion occurring simultaneously in Western Europe. The 15th century saw Portuguese explorers beginning to push down the African coast, seeking maritime routes to the spice-producing regions of Asia. In 1488, Bartholomew Dias rounded the southern tip of Africa, proving that maritime passage from Europe to the Indian Ocean was possible. In 1498, Vasco da Gama completed the journey to India, establishing direct maritime contact between Europe and Asia for the first time. These Portuguese voyages were motivated by the desire to circumvent the overland routes controlled by Islamic powers and the Italian city-states that dominated Mediterranean trade. Spices, which had traveled overland through the Middle East and Central Asia, commanded extremely high prices in Europe. If Portuguese ships could sail directly to the spice islands of Southeast Asia, they could obtain these valuable goods without enriching Muslim merchants or Venetian intermediaries. The success of these maritime ventures had profound implications for the Silk Road. Maritime transport could move larger cargoes more cheaply than caravans. Ships faced different hazards than land travelers: storms, navigation errors, pirates, but avoided the extreme environments of deserts and high mountain passes. Coastal cities with good harbors could become trade centers without needing to be situated on traditional overland routes. The Spanish, not to be outdone by their Portuguese rivals, sponsored Christopher Columbus's westward voyage in 1492, hoping to reach Asia by sailing west instead of east. Though Columbus famously encountered the Americas instead of Asia, Spanish exploration and conquest in the New World would ultimately create new global trade patterns that further marginalized the traditional Silk Road. Meanwhile, the overland routes faced their own challenges. The fragmentation of political authority in Central Asia after the Mongol Empire's collapse meant that merchants had to navigate between numerous independent powers, each with its own taxes and regulations. The security that the Mongols had provided vanished. Bandits proliferated. Political instability made some routes too dangerous to use. The Ottoman Empire, which emerged from Anatolia to become a major power in the 15th century, conquered Constantinople in 1453, extinguishing the Byzantine Empire. The Ottomans proceeded to conquer much of the Middle East, including Egypt and the holy cities of Mecca and Medina. By the early 16th century, Ottoman power extended from Hungary to the Persian Gulf, controlling crucial portions of the traditional Silk Road routes. The Ottomans maintained the trade routes within their territory and benefited from taxes on goods passing through their lands. However, their relations with Christian European powers were often hostile, which complicated European access to Asian goods via Ottoman-controlled routes. This hostility encouraged European efforts to find alternative routes, one more factor promoting maritime over overland trade. In Persia, the Safavid dynasty emerged in the early 16th century, establishing Sharia Islam as the state religion and creating a sophisticated empire that would last more than 2 centuries. The Safavids maintained portions of the Silk Road within their territory, and the city of Isfahan, which became their capital, remained an important commercial center. However, the Safavid-Ottoman rivalry, often expressed through warfare, disrupted trade routes that crossed between their territories. Central Asia saw the rise of various local powers, none achieving the scope or stability of earlier empires. The Chagatai Khanate fragmented into competing principalities. Various Turkish and Mongol dynasties ruled different regions. Bokhara and Samarkand remained important cities but no longer enjoyed the same commercial significance they had held during the Islamic Golden Age or the Mongol period. China's relationship with Central Asia changed under the Ming. Rather than maintaining the extensive military presence the Tang had established or the direct rule the Mongols had exercised, the Ming adopted a more defensive posture. They strengthened the Great Wall, symbolically and literally marking a boundary between civilization and barbarism in traditional Chinese thinking. They engaged with Central Asian powers primarily through the tributary system, where foreign rulers acknowledged Chinese supremacy in exchange for trading privileges and diplomatic recognition. The tributary system allowed controlled trade but reflected a mindset different from the cosmopolitan embrace of foreign influences that had characterized the Tang dynasty. Foreign merchants could come to China and trade at designated locations under government supervision, but the freewheeling commercial and cultural exchange of earlier periods was discouraged. This restrictive approach reduced the volume of overland trade and the degree of cultural exchange along the Silk Road. Yet the Silk Road didn't disappear entirely. Trade continued, though at reduced levels. Certain goods still moved along the traditional routes. Luxury items that could bear the costs and risks of overland transport, precious stones, certain textiles, valuable medicines, continued to travel by caravan. Pilgrims still journeyed to holy sites. Scholars and religious teachers still moved between centers of learning. The 16th century saw one last major attempt to revive the Silk Road's fortunes. Timur, also known as Tamerlane, had already in the late 14th century conquered much of Central Asia and the Middle East, briefly recreating something like the Mongol Empire. Though Timur's empire fragmented after his death in 1405, his descendants established powerful states in Central Asia and India. The Timurid Renaissance in Persia and Central Asia during the 15th century saw a flowering of art, architecture, literature, and science. Cities like Herat and Samarkand became centers of cultural achievement. Timurid rulers patronized artists and scholars, creating magnificent works of architecture and supporting scientific inquiry. This cultural flourishing demonstrated that the Silk Road cities retained vitality and sophistication even as their commercial importance declined. The Mughal Empire, founded by Babur, a Timurid descendant, in India in 1526, created another major power along the periphery of the Silk Road network. The Mughals built a sophisticated empire that would last into the 19th century, presiding over economic prosperity and cultural achievement. However, the Mughal Empire oriented itself primarily toward the Indian Ocean maritime trade rather than the Central Asian overland routes. As the 16th century progressed, the shift from overland to maritime trade accelerated. Portuguese ships established routes from Europe to India, Southeast Asia, and eventually China and Japan. Spanish galleons connected the Americas with Asia across the Pacific. Dutch and English merchants entered Asian waters, competing with the Portuguese for control of maritime trade. These sea routes increasingly dominated global commerce. The commodities traded also changed. New World products, silver from the Americas, tobacco, potatoes, maize, chocolate, entered global circulation. These goods had no precedent in Old World trade and thus no established overland routes. Their distribution naturally followed maritime pathways. Similarly, European demand shifted toward products most efficiently transported by sea. Bulk spices, sugar, coffee, tea in large quantities. Silk remained valuable and silk trade continued, but even silk increasingly traveled by sea. Chinese silk loaded onto ships at ports like Canton could reach European markets more quickly and cheaply than silk transported overland through Central Asia and the Middle East. The comparative advantage of maritime transport became overwhelming for most commodities. The intellectual and technological exchanges that had characterized the Silk Road also declined. The cosmopolitan centers of learning in Central Asia, Bokhara, Samarkand, Merv, no longer attracted scholars from across Eurasia. Islamic science, which had been so vibrant during the Golden Age, entered a period of relative stagnation. Chinese learning, though remaining sophisticated, became less accessible to foreigners as China turned inward. Europe, meanwhile, was entering its renaissance and would soon experience the scientific revolution. European intellectuals rediscovered Greek and Roman learning, much of it preserved in Arabic translations that had traveled along the Silk Road in earlier centuries. They built on this foundation, developing new scientific methods and technologies. But the direction of intellectual exchange was shifting. Europe was becoming a source rather than a recipient of knowledge. The Protestant Reformation, beginning with Martin Luther in 1517, created new religious divisions in Europe that would have global ramifications. The religious warfare and competition that followed would eventually help drive European colonial expansion, as different European powers sought to spread their versions of Christianity and to secure resources to fund their conflicts. This European expansionism would ultimately create a new form of global connection very different from the Silk Road model. The 16th century also saw the beginning of what historians call the Columbian Exchange, the transfer of plants, animals, diseases, people and cultures between the Old World and the Americas. This exchange created new patterns of global connection that didn't involve the traditional Silk Road routes at all. The center of global trade was shifting from the Central Asian overland routes to Atlantic and Pacific maritime routes. Yet even as the Silk Road declined in economic importance, its cultural legacy endured. The foods that had traveled along the routes, pasta in Italy derived from Chinese noodles, perhaps, spices in European cuisine, tea drinking spreading from China to Islamic lands and eventually Europe, remained part of daily life. The artistic techniques and motifs that had spread along the routes continued to influence creative work. The religions that had traveled the Silk Road, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity in its various forms, continued to shape spiritual life across Asia. The cities of the Silk Road adapted to new realities. Some declined to mere shadows of their former glory. Merv, which never fully recovered from Mongol devastation, eventually became a minor settlement. Other cities found new roles: administrative centers for emerging empires, regional trade hubs, agricultural market towns. A few, like Isfahan and Bokhara, remained culturally significant even as their economic importance waned. Caravans still crossed the deserts and mountains but in reduced numbers. The caravanserais, those remarkable institutions that had facilitated trade for centuries, became less numerous and less well-maintained. The sophisticated commercial practices that had developed to support long-distance trade, letters of credit, partnership arrangements, insurance mechanisms, found new applications in maritime trade and emerging banking systems. Travelers still journeyed along portions of the old routes, but they were more likely to be religious pilgrims, diplomatic envoys, or adventurous individuals than the merchants who had once been the Silk Road's lifeblood. Their accounts, when they left any, often expressed nostalgia for the route's former glory, describing ruined cities and abandoned caravanserais as melancholy reminders of better days. The technology of the Silk Road era, the two-humped Bactrian camel ideally suited to cold climates and the one-humped dromedary perfect for hot deserts, the techniques of desert and mountain navigation, the knowledge of water sources and safe routes. This accumulated wisdom didn't disappear but became less economically significant as maritime shipping offered superior alternatives for most purposes. As the 16th century drew to a close, the overland Silk Road had become a shadow of its former self. It wasn't completely dead. Trade and travel continued, but it had lost the central importance it had held for more than 1,000 years. The global economy was reorganizing around different routes and different patterns. The age of the Silk Road was ending, though its echoes would persist. Rest now in a caravanserai somewhere in Central Asia in the late 16th century. The building, constructed in a more prosperous era, shows signs of neglect. Where once it would have been full of merchants and their goods, now only a few travelers shelter here for the night. An old merchant, perhaps the last of his family to engage in long-distance trade, tells stories of his grandfather's time when caravans were larger and profits greater. Outside, the stars that have guided travelers for millennia still shine with the same brilliance. The desert wind carries the same sense it has always carried. The mountains stand eternal and unmoved by human affairs. But the human world is changing, reorganizing, finding new pathways. The Silk Road is fading, not in a sudden catastrophe but in a gradual dimming, like a candle burning down, its flame growing smaller and smaller until it finally gutters out. Let this peaceful scene of a quiet caravanserai at night settle into your mind. The old merchant's voice grows softer as he tires, his stories becoming murmurs, then silence. The gentle sounds of the night, wind, the movements of animals, the soft breathing of sleeping travelers, these sounds grow more distant, fading like the Silk Road itself, until they merge with the rhythm of your own breathing, calm and steady, as we move toward the final chapters of our journey through the Silk Road's long history. As the 19th century dawned, the Silk Road had largely faded from European consciousness. The route still existed, and some trade continued, but the great commercial and cultural exchanges that had once flowed along these pathways had shifted to maritime routes in different regions. Central Asia had become a backwater, peripheral to the main currents of global commerce and power. But the 19th century would see renewed European interest in these ancient routes, driven by imperial competition, archaeological curiosity, and romantic fascination with the exotic East. The dominant geopolitical reality shaping Central Asian affairs in the 19th century was what came to be called the Great Game. The strategic rivalry between the British and Russian empires for influence over Central Asia and approaches to India. The British controlled India, the jewel of their empire, and viewed any Russian expansion toward India as an existential threat. The Russians, expanding southward and eastward from their European heartland, saw Central Asia as a natural sphere of influence and opportunity. This rivalry unfolded across the territories that had once been the Silk Road's heartland. As Russian forces pushed southward into Kazakhstan and the Central Asian Khanates, British officials in India watched nervously, fearing Russian designs on Afghanistan and ultimately India. The Great Game involved military campaigns, diplomatic maneuvering, espionage, and exploration. It brought the ancient Silk Road cities back into the attention of European powers, though for very different reasons than the trade that had once made them prosperous. Russian expansion into Central Asia accelerated in the mid-19th century. The Khanates of Khiva, Bokhara, and Kokand, successor states to earlier Central Asian powers, had maintained a degree of independence, but they were militarily weak compared to modern European armies. Russian forces, equipped with artillery and modern weapons, found conquest relatively straightforward despite the difficult terrain and long supply lines. Tashkent fell to Russian forces in 1865. Samarkand, that legendary city whose name had resonated through Silk Road history for 2,000 years, was captured in 1868. Bokhara became a Russian protectorate in the same year. By the 1870s, Russian control extended throughout most of Central Asia, though the process of consolidating this control would continue for years. The Russian conquest brought dramatic changes to these ancient cities. Russian colonial administrators restructured urban planning, creating separate Russian quarters with European-style buildings alongside the traditional Islamic old cities. Russian legal and administrative systems replaced traditional governance. Russian settlers arrived, establishing agricultural colonies and commercial enterprises. Telegraph lines connected Central Asian cities to Moscow, bringing news and instructions within hours instead of weeks. Yet Russian rule also brought a degree of stability and renewed commercial opportunity. The Russians built railroads connecting Central Asia to the Russian Empire's transportation network. The Trans-Caspian Railway, completed in the 1880s, linked Central Asia to the Caspian Sea and thus to Russian markets. Cotton cultivation expanded dramatically under Russian encouragement, transforming Central Asian agriculture and economy. Markets found new outlets as Russian demand replaced the long-distance trade that had once sustained these cities. The British, watching Russian expansion anxiously, responded with their own initiatives in regions bordering Russia's new territories. They strengthened their position in Afghanistan, fighting two Anglo-Afghan wars to maintain Afghan independence as a buffer between Russian and British territories. They sent explorers and spies into Central Asia to gather intelligence about Russian activities. They mapped frontier regions with increasing accuracy, seeking defensible boundaries and strategic advantages. This imperial competition inadvertently led to renewed European interest in the Silk Road's history and archaeology. European explorers, traveling through Central Asia for strategic and diplomatic purposes, encountered ruins of ancient cities and evidence of the region's glorious past. They heard local stories about buried treasures and lost civilizations. Some developed genuine scholarly interest in uncovering this forgotten history. The late 19th and early 20th centuries saw a wave of archaeological expeditions to Central Asian Silk Road sites. These expeditions were often entangled with imperial politics and espionage, but they also produced genuine discoveries that revolutionized understanding of Silk Road history. The expeditions removed enormous quantities of artifacts, manuscripts, and artworks from Central Asian sites, carrying them to museums in Russia, Britain, France, Germany, and elsewhere. Aurel Stein, a Hungarian-born British archaeologist and explorer, conducted several expeditions to Central Asia between 1900 and 1930. His most famous discovery came at the Dunhuang cave temples, where he persuaded a Taoist monk who was guarding the caves to sell him thousands of ancient manuscripts from the sealed library cave. These manuscripts, now split between the British Museum and other institutions, proved invaluable for understanding Buddhism, daily life and linguistic diversity along the Silk Road. Stein also excavated sites in the Taklamakan Desert, uncovering remarkable artifacts preserved by the arid climate. He found ancient Buddhist paintings and sculptures, documents in multiple languages and scripts, textiles showing the influence of various cultures, and everyday objects that revealed how people lived along the Silk Road. His work, while criticized for removing these artifacts from their original contexts, enormously enriched scholarly understanding of Silk Road history. Sven Hedin, a Swedish explorer, traveled extensively through Central Asia between the 1890s and 1930s. Hedin was particularly interested in geography and cartography, creating detailed maps of regions that had been poorly known to Europeans. He discovered ancient ruins in the Taklamakan Desert, including the lost city of Lulan, and documented geographical features with scientific precision. His expeditions combined exploration, geography, archaeology, and political observation. Albert von Lecoq, a German archaeologist, led expeditions to Turfan and other Silk Road sites in the early 20th century. He excavated Buddhist cave temples, uncovering magnificent murals that revealed the artistic synthesis of Silk Road cultures. Many of these murals, carefully removed and transported to Berlin, provided European audiences with their first views of Gandhara-style Buddhist art and the multicultural artistic traditions that had flourished in Central Asia. Paul Pelliot, a French sinologist, was another major figure in Silk Road archaeology. Like Stein, he obtained thousands of manuscripts from Dunhuang, though his superior knowledge of Chinese allowed him to make more discriminating selections. His scholarly publications helped establish Silk Road studies as a serious academic field. The Pelliot collection at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France remains an important resource for researchers. These archaeological expeditions revealed to the Western world the remarkable history and cultural achievements of the Silk Road. Museums in London, Paris, Berlin, and St. Petersburg began displaying Central Asian artifacts. Scholars studied the texts and artworks, piecing together the history of Buddhist transmission, artistic development, linguistic diversity, and daily life along the ancient routes. The Silk Road, which had faded from living memory, became a subject of intense scholarly and popular interest. However, the removal of these artifacts remains controversial. From one perspective, the archaeologists preserved materials that might otherwise have been destroyed, neglected, or lost. The manuscripts they removed were studied, conserved, and made accessible to researchers. From another perspective, they were colonial plunderers who robbed Central Asian peoples of their cultural heritage, removing artifacts to European museums where local communities couldn't access them. This debate continues today. Many of the countries where these artifacts originated have requested their return, arguing that cultural property should be housed where it was created and where it holds cultural significance. Museums holding the artifacts often argue that they are better equipped to preserve and study them, that the artifacts have become part of world heritage rather than national property, and that returning everything would be impractical. The question remains unresolved. Meanwhile, the imperial competition that had driven exploration continued. The British and Russians came close to war several times over Central Asian issues. British fears of Russian invasion of India verged on paranoia at times, though Russian ambitions in the region were real enough. The competition played out through proxy conflicts, diplomatic incidents, and the occasional small-scale military clash. This rivalry produced a literature of adventure and espionage. Rudyard Kipling's novel Kim, published in 1901, romanticized the Great Game, portraying it as a thrilling contest of wits and courage. Peter Hopkirk's later histories, particularly The Great Game, The Struggle for Empire in Central Asia, provided more sober accounts but conveyed the drama and significance of the imperial competition. These works helped shape Western perceptions of Central Asia as a romantic and dangerous frontier. The 19th century also saw the beginning of systematic study of Silk Road languages and cultures. Scholars began deciphering ancient scripts found on manuscripts and inscriptions. They studied the evolution of languages as they spread along the trade routes. They analyzed how religious texts were translated between languages and how translation choices reflected cultural adaptation. This linguistic work revealed the remarkable diversity and complexity of Silk Road societies. The discovery of texts in languages that were no longer spoken proved particularly fascinating. The Tocharian languages, Indo-European languages spoken in the Tarim Basin, were unknown to modern scholarship until manuscripts were discovered in the early 20th century. Their existence demonstrated that Indo-European speakers had reached far into Central Asia, complicating simplified narratives of East-West division. Documents in Sogdian, the language of the Great Silk Road merchants, revealed the extent and sophistication of Sogdian commercial networks. Khotanese, Sanskrit, various forms of Turkic languages, Tibetan, Chinese, and scripts adapted from various writing systems. The linguistic diversity uncovered by archaeologists demonstrated how the Silk Road had functioned as a zone of intense cross-cultural communication. The artistic discoveries from Central Asia astonished scholars and the public. The Buddhist murals found in cave temples showed artistic traditions blending Greek, Persian, Indian, and Chinese influences. They depicted people of various ethnicities, wearing clothing showing cultural mixing, practicing Buddhism in forms that combined Indian origins with local adaptations. The paintings revealed the cosmopolitan character of Silk Road cities at their height. Textile discoveries proved equally remarkable. Fragments of silk showing Persian patterns, wool textiles with Greek designs, cotton goods displaying Indian motifs. These finds demonstrated the flow of goods and artistic ideas along the routes. Some textiles combined techniques from multiple traditions, showing how craftsmen learned from and influenced each other. The preservation of these delicate materials in desert climates provided tangible evidence of trade and cultural exchange. As the 19th century progressed and the 20th century began, Western understanding of the Silk Road evolved from vague romantic notions to increasingly sophisticated historical knowledge. Scholars assembled the timeline of Silk Road development from Chinese sources, Western classical texts, Islamic histories, archaeological finds, and manuscript evidence. They pieced together the routes merchants had followed, the goods they had traded, the political powers that had controlled or protected the routes at different times. This scholarship helped establish Silk Road as a concept in Western thought, though the term itself was relatively recent. The German geographer Ferdinand von Richthofen coined Seidenstrasse, Silk Road, in the 1870s to describe the ancient trade routes. The term caught on, providing a memorable label for the complex networks of exchange that had connected East and West for more than a millennium. Yet even as scholarship revealed the Silk Road's history, the routes themselves continued their decline into obscurity. The railroads that Russia built served Russian imperial interests and linked Central Asia to Russian markets, but they didn't restore the East-West trade patterns of the classical Silk Road. Maritime shipping remained far superior for most long-distance trade. The commercial significance of the overland routes continued to diminish. The cities that had once been Silk Road jewels adapted to new realities or declined. Samarkand, under Russian rule, became a provincial center with its magnificent Islamic architecture maintained alongside new Russian buildings. Bokhara retained cultural and religious significance but lost its commercial importance. Kashgar, at the edge of Chinese-controlled territory, remained a regional market town but no longer saw the international caravans that had once been common. The 20th century would bring further dramatic changes to the Silk Road regions. The Russian Revolution of 1917 would transform Russian Central Asia into Soviet republics. Chinese political upheavals would affect the eastern portions of the routes. The two world wars would reshape global power structures. But even as the living Silk Road faded into history, interest in its legacy would continue to grow. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Silk Road existed primarily as a historical memory and a source of archaeological treasures. The routes that had once been vital arteries of global commerce had become minor regional roads. The cities that had prospered from international trade now served local needs or provincial administration. But the memory of what had been, preserved in ruins, manuscripts, and scholarly reconstruction, ensured that the Silk Road would not be forgotten. Imagine now an evening in Samarkand in the late 19th century. The old city, with its magnificent Islamic architecture, sits alongside the newer Russian quarter with its European-style buildings. In the bazaar, merchants sell local products, cotton, fruits, textiles, to regional customers rather than the international traders who once thronged here. A Russian archaeologist, visiting the city to examine ancient sites, walks through streets that have witnessed 2,000 years of history. The setting sun illuminates the brilliant blue tiles of Timurid-era buildings, creating that play of light and color that has enchanted visitors for centuries. In the distance, the mountains stand as they have always stood, marking the routes that caravans once followed. The call to prayer echoes from minarets, continuing traditions that have shaped this city for more than a millennium. History is everywhere here, layered like sediment, visible in architecture, embedded in geography, living in memory even as the present takes new forms. Let this image of Samarkand at twilight settle peacefully into your mind. The light fading on the blue tiles, the sounds of the city preparing for evening, the weight of history present in every stone and every street, all of this becomes softer and more distant, the colors dimming, the sounds fading, until everything merges with the gentle darkness of night and the quiet rhythm of your breathing, peaceful and steady, as we prepare for the final chapter of our journey. The 20th century brought catastrophic changes to the Silk Road regions. The First World War, the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, the Second World War, and the Cold War all reshaped the political map of Eurasia. The Soviet Union incorporated Central Asian territories as Soviet Socialist republics. China, after decades of civil war and Japanese invasion, came under communist control in 1949. The Silk Road regions found themselves divided by the Iron Curtain, their connections severed by ideological conflict and closed borders. During the Cold War, the ancient trade routes that had once connected civilizations became barriers between hostile powers. The Soviet Union's southern borders were heavily militarized. China's western regions, always peripheral to Chinese civilization, became even more isolated. Travel between east and west became difficult or impossible for most people. The cosmopolitan exchange that had characterized the Silk Road at its height seemed irrelevant to a world divided into competing ideological blocs. Yet even during this period of division, interest in the Silk Road persisted. Archaeologists continued to excavate sites, though access was often restricted by political considerations. Scholars studied the manuscripts and artifacts that had been removed in earlier decades. Museums maintained their collections of Silk Road materials. The Silk Road existed primarily as a historical subject, fascinating for what it revealed about pre-modern globalization but seemingly irrelevant to contemporary realities. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 transformed the Silk Road regions once again. The Central Asian Soviet republics, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan, became independent nations. These new countries faced the challenges of building national identities, developing economies, and navigating relationships with powerful neighbors including Russia, China, and more distant powers like the United States and European nations. Many of these newly independent nations looked to their Silk Road heritage as a source of national identity and pride. Uzbekistan particularly emphasized its history as home to Samarkand and Bokhara, those legendary Silk Road cities. The government invested in restoring historical monuments, promoting cultural tourism, and celebrating the region's role in facilitating global exchange. The Silk Road became a symbol of Central Asian significance in world history. Archaeological work intensified in the post-Soviet period as international collaboration became possible. Sites that had been inaccessible or understudied for decades received renewed attention. Modern archaeological techniques, satellite imagery, radiocarbon dating, DNA analysis, advanced preservation methods, revealed new information about Silk Road history. International teams brought together scholars from multiple countries, creating research collaborations that sometimes echoed the cosmopolitan character of the historical Silk Road. UNESCO, the United Nations Educational, Scientific and Cultural Organization, took increasing interest in preserving Silk Road heritage. In 1988, UNESCO launched the Integral Study of the Silk Roads, Roads of Dialogue project, bringing together scholars from countries along the routes to study and preserve this shared heritage. This project emphasized the Silk Road as a symbol of cultural exchange and dialogue rather than just commercial routes. UNESCO began designating Silk Road sites as World Heritage Sites, recognizing their universal value. Samarkand's historic center received World Heritage designation, as did the ancient city of Bokhara, portions of the Great Wall of China, the Mogeo Caves at Dunhuang, and numerous other sites. These designations brought international attention, tourism revenue, and sometimes controversy about how to balance preservation with development and tourist access. In 2014, UNESCO inscribed the Silk Roads, the routes network of Chang'an-Tianshan Corridor, as a serial World Heritage Site, recognizing multiple sites across 3 countries, China, Kazakhstan, and Kyrgyzstan, as parts of an interconnected system. This collaborative nomination represented a new approach to heritage preservation, acknowledging that the Silk Road's significance lay not in individual sites but in the networks connecting them. Cultural tourism along the Silk Road routes grew dramatically in the late 20th and early 21st centuries. Travelers, drawn by romantic notions of ancient caravans and exotic cultures, began following the historic routes. Tour companies offered Silk Road journeys, typically combining visits to major historical sites with glimpses of contemporary Central Asian life. This tourism brought economic benefits but also raised concerns about commercialization and the potential damage to fragile archaeological sites. The most dramatic recent development related to the Silk Road came in 2013, when Chinese President Xi Jinping announced the Belt and Road Initiative, originally called One Belt, One Road. This enormous infrastructure and development program explicitly invoked Silk Road imagery, proposing to create modern equivalents of the ancient routes through massive investments in transportation, energy, telecommunications, and other infrastructure projects across Asia, Europe, Africa, and beyond. The Belt and Road Initiative represents the most ambitious attempt to recreate Silk Road-scale connections since the route's historical decline. The Belt refers to overland corridors roughly following ancient Silk Road routes through Central Asia toward Europe. The road refers to maritime routes connecting Chinese ports with Southeast Asia, South Asia, the Middle East, and Africa. Together, these components envision comprehensive infrastructure linking more than 60 countries representing over 60% of the world's population. China has committed hundreds of billions of dollars to Belt and Road projects, building railroads and highways, constructing ports and pipelines, establishing telecommunications networks, creating industrial parks and special economic zones. Projects have been launched in countries from Pakistan to Poland, from Kenya to Kazakhstan. The scale is unprecedented in modern development efforts, exceeding even the Marshall Plan that helped rebuild Europe after World War II. Supporters of the Belt and Road Initiative see it as creating much-needed infrastructure, facilitating trade, promoting economic development, and fostering international cooperation. They invoke the historical Silk Road as a model of peaceful exchange and mutual benefit, arguing that modern infrastructure can replicate the prosperity and cultural exchange that characterized the route's golden age. Chinese officials explicitly frame the initiative as reviving the Silk Road spirit for the modern era. Critics raise concerns about debt dependency, environmental damage, labor practices, political influence, and strategic motivations. They note that many recipient countries have taken on substantial debt to finance Belt and Road projects, potentially compromising their sovereignty. They question whether the projects serve primarily Chinese strategic interests rather than recipient countries' development needs. They point out that the historical Silk Road involved multiple independent actors, whereas the Belt and Road Initiative is primarily Chinese-directed. Regardless of one's assessment of the Belt and Road Initiative's merits and risks, it has undeniably brought the Silk Road back into contemporary political and economic discourse. The term Silk Road appears regularly in discussions of international development, geopolitics, and global trade. The historical routes have become reference points for debates about globalization, cultural exchange, and the future of international relations. The digital age has created what some call a new Silk Road, in the form of fiber optic cables and digital communication networks linking Asia, Europe, and beyond. The term Digital Silk Road has emerged to describe China's efforts to build technological infrastructure as part of the Belt and Road Initiative: satellite systems, 5G networks, e-commerce platforms, digital payment systems. This metaphorical extension of Silk Road imagery to cyberspace shows how deeply the concept has penetrated modern thinking about global connection. Academic study of the Silk Road has flourished in recent decades. Universities worldwide have established Silk Road studies programs. Scholarly conferences bring together researchers from multiple disciplines: history, archaeology, linguistics, art history, religious studies, economics. New archaeological discoveries continue to reveal information about Silk Road societies. Analysis of ancient DNA provides insights into population movements and interactions. Isotope analysis reveals where people came from and what they ate. Museums have mounted major Silk Road exhibitions, making artifacts accessible to broad audiences. These exhibitions typically emphasize the diversity of cultures along the routes, the artistic achievements of Silk Road societies, and the remarkable extent of ancient globalization. They often include interactive elements helping visitors understand the distances involved and the challenges merchants faced. Major exhibitions in New York, London, Paris, and elsewhere have introduced millions of people to Silk Road history. Popular culture has also embraced Silk Road themes. Video games set on the Silk Road allow players to experience caravan trade virtually. Novels set in Silk Road contexts explore the multicultural environments of ancient trading cities. Documentary films trace the routes, combining historical information with contemporary travel. The Silk Road has become part of global cultural imagination, a symbol of adventure, exchange, and cross-cultural connection. Food culture has discovered Silk Road themes. with restaurants emphasizing Central Asian cuisine and dishes that traveled along the trade routes. The fusion of different culinary traditions that occurred in Silk Road cities provides inspiration for contemporary chefs exploring cross-cultural cooking. Wine enthusiasts have revived interest in grape varieties and winemaking techniques that spread along the Silk Road. Even the term Silk Road appears in restaurant names and food product branding, trading on associations with exotic flavors and ancient trade. The contemporary geopolitics of the Silk Road regions remain complex. Central Asian countries navigate between powerful neighbors: Russia to the north, China to the east, Iran and Turkey to the west. They seek to maintain independence while benefiting from economic relationships with multiple partners. They balance traditional cultural ties with the need for modernization and development. The historical Silk Road, with its model of multiple independent actors cooperating for mutual benefit, sometimes serves as an idealized reference point. Afghanistan, which sits at the crossroads of ancient Silk Road routes, has suffered decades of war and instability. The country's strategic position, between Central Asia, South Asia, and the Middle East, has made it a battleground for competing powers from Alexander the Great through the British and Russians in the 19th century to the Soviet Union and the United States in more recent decades. Peace and stability in Afghanistan remain elusive, preventing the country from fully benefiting from its historical position at the crossroads of civilizations. The Uyghur people of Xinjiang in western China maintain cultural connections to their Silk Road heritage. Their capital, Urumqi, stands near the ancient routes, and traditional Uyghur culture reflects the diverse influences that flowed through the region. However, Uyghur-Chinese relations have become increasingly problematic, with international concerns about Chinese government policies toward Uyghur culture and religion. The situation demonstrates that the Silk Road's legacy includes not just cultural exchange but also the complex politics of multicultural regions. Environmental challenges affect the Silk Road regions significantly. The Aral Sea, once the fourth largest lake in the world, has shrunk dramatically due to Soviet-era irrigation projects diverting its source rivers for cotton cultivation. This ecological disaster has created health problems, economic difficulties, and environmental degradation affecting millions of people. The desertification, water scarcity, and climate change affecting Central Asia pose challenges that will require international cooperation to address. Yet there are reasons for optimism about the Silk Road region's future. Economic development, while uneven, has improved living standards in many areas. Educational opportunities have expanded. Cultural heritage preservation has become a priority for many governments. International tourism brings both revenue and cross-cultural understanding. The historical legacy of the Silk Road as a zone of peaceful exchange and mutual benefit provides a positive vision that contemporary actors sometimes invoke to justify cooperation. The study of the Silk Road offers lessons potentially relevant to modern challenges. The historical routes demonstrated that long-distance trade and cultural exchange could flourish when security was maintained, when different cultures respected each other's traditions, when intermediaries facilitated communication across linguistic and cultural boundaries. They showed that prosperity could be broadly shared when trade operated relatively freely. They proved that different religions and philosophies could coexist peacefully and even influence each other creatively. The Silk Road also demonstrated the fragility of interconnected systems. The same routes that carried silk and spices also transmitted plague. Political instability could rapidly disrupt trade that had flourished for centuries. Environmental changes, droughts, earthquakes, shifting river courses, could doom cities that had prospered for generations. The benefits of exchange came with vulnerabilities to disruption. As our long journey through Silk Road history comes to a close, we can reflect on what this remarkable network of routes represents. The Silk Road wasn't just about trade, though trade was important. It wasn't just about Buddhism spreading from India to China, though that was transformative. It wasn't just about artistic influences crossing continents or technologies spreading across cultures, though both occurred extensively. The Silk Road represents something more fundamental: the human capacity for connection across vast distances and profound differences. It demonstrates our species' endless curiosity about what lies beyond the horizon. It shows our willingness to risk danger and hardship for profit, knowledge, or spiritual insight. It proves that we can cooperate across linguistic, cultural, and religious boundaries when doing so serves mutual interests. For more than 1,500 years, from roughly the 2nd century BCE to the 15th century CE, the Silk Road functioned as perhaps the most important network connecting human civilizations. Goods, people, ideas, technologies, religions, and diseases moved along these routes, shaping the development of societies from China to the Mediterranean. The exchange was never merely economic, it was cultural, intellectual, spiritual, and deeply human. The modern world, with its global trade networks, instant communication, and cultural hybridization, sometimes seems to have surpassed what the Silk Road represented. We can communicate across the planet in seconds rather than months. Goods cross oceans in weeks rather than years. Ideas spread virally rather than traveling from one merchant to the next. Yet in some ways the modern world is trying to recreate what the Silk Road achieved. Peaceful exchange, mutual benefit, cultural understanding across differences. The Belt and Road Initiative, whatever its ultimate success or failure, reflects recognition that infrastructure connecting distant regions can generate prosperity and cooperation. UNESCO's heritage preservation efforts acknowledge that the Silk Road legacy belongs to all humanity, not just the nations where physical sites happen to be located. Academic study of the Silk Road provides insights into how different cultures can interact creatively. Popular fascination with Silk Road history suggests that people find inspiration in stories of ancient connection. As you rest in this quiet moment, having traveled with me through more than 2,000 years of Silk Road history, imagine standing at a crossroads. One path leads east toward the distant Pacific. Another leads west toward the Mediterranean. Others branch north toward the steppes and south toward the Indian Ocean. All around you, the landscape holds traces of those who came before. Merchants seeking profit, monks seeking enlightenment, artists seeking inspiration, ordinary people seeking better lives. The wind that blows across this crossroads has witnessed everything: the rise and fall of empires, the passage of countless caravans, the exchange of ideas that would shape civilizations. It carries scents that have traveled across continents and whispers of languages that were once spoken here. Time itself seems layered at this crossroads, with past and present existing simultaneously. But now the wind is growing quieter, its whispers fading. The landscape softens and blurs. The paths ahead fade from view. Everything becomes peaceful, still, and gentle. The entire vast history we've traversed together, from Zhang Qian's first journey to the modern Belt and Road Initiative, settles like gentle snowfall, covering everything in a quiet blanket of peace. Your journey through the Silk Road's history is complete. The stories we've shared, the scenes we've witnessed, the enormous sweep of time we've traveled, all of this rests now in your memory like ancient treasures preserved in a desert cave, waiting to be rediscovered when you choose to recall them. But for now, there is only peace, only the gentle rhythm of your breathing, only the deep rest that comes at the end of a long journey. The Silk Road, that magnificent network of connections spanning continents and centuries, has given us its gifts, its stories, its lessons, its inspiration. It has shown us what humans can achieve when we reach across differences to exchange what we have and learn from each other. It has demonstrated both the heights of cultural achievement and the depths of human cruelty. It has proven that we are all connected, all part of a single human story that unfolds across time and space. Sleep now, dear traveler, with the Silk Road's peaceful blessing. Let its long history be like a comfortable blanket wrapped around you. Let the stars that guided ancient caravans watch over your rest. Let the gentle winds that once carried merchants across deserts now carry you into peaceful dreams. The journey is complete. The story has been told. All is well. Rest peacefully now, as travelers have rested in caravanserais across the centuries, knowing that tomorrow brings new journeys, but tonight brings only peace. If you've enjoyed this journey through the complete history of the Silk Road, I invite you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more sleep stories exploring the fascinating currents of human history. Each story is crafted with care to help you rest while enriching your understanding of the remarkable world we've inherited from those who came before us. May your sleep be as peaceful as a quiet oasis after a long desert crossing, and may your dreams carry you to distant places where past and present meet in harmony. Sleep well, dear traveler. Until next time.